Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. It was a quiet night at the convenience store. The kind of night where time seems to stretch on endlessly, and the hum of the fluorescent lights becomes a constant companion. I was working the graveyard shift, the store empty except for the occasional customer. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, it was just another slow shift to get through. Around 11 p.m., the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. He was wearing a worn-out jacket and jeans, his face shadowed by the hood pulled low over his head. He moved toward the counter with a slow, deliberate pace, as if unsure of his next move. When he reached the register, he ordered a pack of cigarettes, handing me a crumpled bill without a word. I rang him up, keeping my eyes on the transaction, but something about him felt off. There was an air of discomfort around him, an unease that made me instinctively glance toward the back of the store. He paid and left, the door jingling behind him, and I thought little of it. It was just another routine customer, right? An hour passed in near silence, the minutes dragging as I wiped down the counter and restocked the shelves. I had begun to zone out when the door opened again. It was the same man standing in the doorway, his eyes darting around nervously. This time he didn't head straight for the counter. Instead, he stood there for a moment, scanning the store like he was looking for something or someone. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. He looked at me, his eyes briefly locking with mine before quickly shifting to the back of the store. "Yeah, I'm looking for directions," he said, his voice shaky. "Can you tell me how to get to Maple Street?" I nodded, but my attention was on him more than the question. He wasn't making eye contact anymore, his gaze flicking nervously to the back of the store, to the narrow aisles that led to the stockroom. I gave him the directions he asked for, but he seemed distracted, like he wasn't really listening. His eyes kept drifting toward the back again and again, almost as if he were waiting for something. As he stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for longer than I thought. The first time he came in, I had barely noticed him, but now, standing there in the dim light of the store, I could feel his eyes on me. There was something unsettling about the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear. I handed him the directions, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maple Street is just a few blocks down. You can't miss it." He took the paper from me, his hand brushing against mine in a brief, cold contact. I watched him turn and head toward the door, but before he left, he paused. "I'll be back in a bit," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I blinked, not sure if I had heard him right. He didn't seem to wait for an answer before he walked out, the door jingling softly as he disappeared into the night. My heart was racing now, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I stood there for a few moments, staring at the door, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe he was just a guy who needed directions and nothing more. But deep down, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had a strange feeling that I hadn't seen the last of him. The minutes passed slowly, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension that had settled in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around the store, but everything appeared normal. The shelves were stocked, the lights flickered in their usual way, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. But the atmosphere felt off. Then the bell jingled again. I turned quickly, and there he was, standing in the doorway once more. This time, his expression was different. There was a tension in his posture, as if he were holding something back. He didn't move toward the counter right away. Instead, he stood there, looking over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the parking lot outside. I could feel my pulse quicken as he finally stepped inside. He glanced around the store, his gaze flicking nervously to the back again. Then to me. You didn't see anyone else come in, did you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I was taken aback. "No," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "No one else is here." He nodded quickly, as if to himself, and then he started to move toward the counter. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, and he kept glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. "Just checking," he muttered under his breath, his words barely audible. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. Why had he asked if I'd seen anyone else? Why did he keep glancing toward the back of the store? It was almost as if he was waiting for something to happen, or someone to show up. But there was no one else there, just the two of us in this quiet, empty store. As he reached the counter, he pulled out his wallet, but his eyes were still darting around, never staying still for long. He didn't seem to be looking for anything specific, just watching, waiting. It was as if he was trying to convince himself that nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my voice was a little shaky. He paused for a moment, his eyes still flicking to the back of the store. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. I took it from him quickly, my fingers brushing his hand once more. This time it felt colder than before. As I handed him his change, he muttered, "I'll be going now." His words were rushed, and he didn't wait for a response before turning and heading for the door. I watched him leave, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. The store felt emptier than before, the silence louder. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for far longer than I realized. Story 2. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, the sound of soft knocking at the door pulling me from my sleep. At first, I thought it was my roommate coming home late as usual. She often had unpredictable hours, and the knock seemed to fit her usual pattern. Groggy, I stumbled out of bed, wiped my eyes, and shuffled toward the door. When I opened it, expecting to see her, I was greeted by nothing but the stillness of the hallway. No roommate, no one in sight. I stood there for a moment, the door slightly ajar, trying to make sense of it. Maybe she had left, I thought, but the sound of knocking didn't make sense for someone just leaving. My confusion only deepened when I noticed something odd at the foot of the door. There on the doormat was a single shoe print. It was clearly visible, a dark impression of a boot in the shape of a heavy sole. I bent down, examining it closely, my heart rate quickening. The shoe didn't look familiar, and it wasn't the kind my roommate would wear. The size seemed too large for hers, and it was the only print, the other side of the doormat undisturbed. I closed the door quickly, my pulse racing. I leaned against it, trying to make sense of the situation. It didn't feel right. I had no memory of hearing footsteps or seeing anyone pass by. The hallway was empty, and there was no sign of movement outside. But that print, there was no mistaking it. It was as if someone had been standing there just outside my door and then left. I waited a few moments before cautiously opening the door again, scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. There was nothing. I stepped outside, my eyes darting to the doormat again, hoping maybe it had been a trick of the light or my tired mind. But the shoe print was still there, a stark reminder that something had happened while I was asleep. I stepped back inside, my mind racing. The only logical explanation was that someone had come to the door, knocked, and left, but I had no idea why. I quickly checked the locks on the door, making sure everything was secure. Then I went into my roommate's room, only to find her fast asleep, undisturbed by the commotion outside. She hadn't been the one knocking, and that only left me with more questions. My nerves were on edge the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep, my mind running through all the possibilities. Had someone been trying to get in? Had they knocked on the door by mistake, thinking it was someone else's apartment? It all felt so strange. The single shoe print, the silence, the lack of any other evidence, it didn't add up. The next morning I called the police, hoping they might have an explanation. They arrived shortly after, taking down my statement and examining the scene. I showed them the shoe print on the doormat, but the officer just frowned, clearly puzzled. They dusted for fingerprints around the door and the doormat, but found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no sign of forced entry, and no other prints. They seemed just as confused as I was. It could have been someone playing a prank, one officer suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. But a prank didn't explain the single shoe print, nor did it account for the eerie feeling I had that something more had happened. I wasn't sure if they believed me, but they assured me they would keep an eye on the area. As they left, they advised me to be cautious, but the whole situation felt unsettling, as though I had just been given an unsatisfactory answer to a question that still lingered. That day I kept the door locked and stayed inside, the feeling of unease never quite leaving me. The police had offered no answers, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there, standing at my door, waiting for something. But why only one shoe print? And why no sign of anyone else? It didn't make sense. As the days went on, I started to notice other strange occurrences. Small things, objects out of place, my keys moved from one spot to another, the faint sound of footsteps outside the door when no one was around. It was subtle, almost like I was imagining it, but the pattern began to form. I checked the locks every night, but the nagging feeling never went away. I couldn't help but wonder if someone was still out there, watching, waiting. My roommate seemed oblivious to it all. She didn't notice anything strange, and when I tried to talk to her about it, she brushed it off. Maybe I was overreacting, she suggested, but the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that something was wrong. The police had found no evidence, but I felt like I was being haunted by the unknown. The unanswered question hung in the air, growing heavier with each passing day. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed a small security camera above the door, hoping it would provide some answers. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever feel safe in my own home again. The thought of someone coming into my apartment, standing at my door, and leaving without a trace was enough to make my skin crawl. The next morning, I checked the footage, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the night, the camera captured the door gently rattling. It was subtle at first, but then it slowly opened, as if by an invisible hand. The door creaked, just like it had when I'd opened it the night of the knock. But there was no one there. No one visible, at least. I rewound the footage, watching it again, my heart racing. The footage was clear someone had opened the door, but there was no sign of a person. The only thing I could see was the doormat, with the faintest outline of a shoe print. It was the same as the night before, but this time, the print seemed to appear out of nowhere. No one had entered, but somehow, the print was there again. I was no closer to understanding what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not alone in this apartment. Story 3. I had been receiving odd phone calls at work for weeks. At first I thought it was a prank, some coworker messing with me, but the calls kept coming. The voice on the other end was always the same deep, labored breathing followed by a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "I see you." It was a phrase one couldn't shake, echoing in my mind long after I hung up. Each call felt like a shadow creeping closer, and the frequency of the calls increased as the days went by. I began to feel paranoid, always checking the office windows to make sure no one was watching me. I even started avoiding looking out the glass door to the parking lot, afraid I might catch a glimpse of the person on the other end of the line. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the sense that I was being followed. It started to affect my work. I couldn't focus on anything without the lingering thought of those calls. I tried blocking the number, but it didn't stop. The calls continued, always from an unlisted number, always with that same unsettling breathing and whisper. I even considered changing my phone number, but I couldn't help but wonder if that would just make things worse. What if the caller was already too close? One afternoon, I sat at my desk, trying to finish up a report, when the phone rang again. My stomach dropped as I glanced at the caller ID. It was an unlisted number, just like all the others. I hesitated, staring at the phone, debating whether to pick it up. But curiosity won out, and I answered the call. The familiar sound of heavy breathing filled the line, followed by the whisper, "I see you." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I felt my pulse quicken. I looked around the office, my eyes darting to the windows. The building was quiet and no one was nearby. I slowly stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. The voice seemed too close, too real. I walked to the window and cautiously peeked outside. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a figure standing just outside the building, their back turned toward me. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette against the dimming light of the evening. But it was enough to make my skin crawl. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The caller was here, outside the building, watching me. I hung up the phone quickly, my hands shaking as I backed away from the window. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone waiting for a ride, someone who had no idea they were freaking me out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The voice on the phone, the whispering words, all of it pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Someone had been watching me for weeks. I grabbed my coat and hurried toward the exit, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. But as I stepped outside, the figure was gone. The parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anyone. It felt like I had imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. I left the building as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The sense of being watched didn't leave me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following me. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but nothing followed. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking about the figure outside the building, about the whisper on the phone. It felt like I was trapped in some sort of nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was watching me. It sounded crazy, even to me. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure again. I checked the locks on the doors multiple times, even though I knew they were secure. I felt like I was losing my mind. I told a few coworkers about the calls, but they brushed it off, thinking it was just a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The calls didn't stop. They came at random times throughout the day, each one more unsettling than the last. The breathing was heavier, more labored, as if the caller was getting closer. And each time the whisper would follow, "I see you." I stopped answering the phone altogether, but it didn't matter. The calls kept coming, filling my voicemail with their creepy messages. Then, one evening, I stayed late at the office to finish up some work. The building was quiet. The only sound the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I was just wrapping up when I heard a noise outside the door. A soft scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging their feet across the floor. My heart stopped, and I froze, my eyes darting toward the door. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher, I heard the scraping noise again, followed by a soft knock on the door. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the person was on the other side. They were here, in the building, and they knew I was alone. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. The police were on their way, but would they make it in time? The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "I see you." Story 4. After moving into my new apartment, I quickly settled into the routine of unpacking and organizing my belongings. It wasn't a bad place, small but cozy. The walls were thin, and I could hear the occasional creak of the building settling, but nothing too out of the ordinary. It was quiet, a perfect change of pace after months of hectic living arrangements. But then, the scratching started. It was subtle at first, like the faintest tapping behind the walls. I convinced myself it was just the pipes or maybe rodents, but as the days went on, the noise grew more persistent. It started in the late hours of the night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, a rhythmic scratching that sent chills crawling up my spine. At first, I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as my imagination running wild in a new, unfamiliar space. But the noise was constant, a never-ending scratching that seemed to come from all directions. It was as if something or someone was trapped within the walls, desperately trying to get out. Each night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the only one who could hear it. One evening, unable to take it any longer, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept around my apartment, searching for the source of the noise. The scratching was louder now, more frantic, and it seemed to echo through the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the exact location. But no matter how hard I tried, the noise seemed to come from everywhere. I checked the walls, the floors, and even the ceiling, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The apartment was old, and I figured it was just the house settling, some old pipes or wires making strange noises. But the longer I listened, the more unnerving it became. It wasn't the sound of pipes, and it certainly wasn't just the building settling. There was something else behind it, something deliberate, something trying to make itself known. I decided to leave it for the night and get some rest. Maybe it would stop on its own, I thought, as I climbed into bed, still hearing the distant scratching. But sleep didn't come. Every creak of the building seemed to amplify the sound, and I lay there wide awake, staring into the darkness. The noise was relentless, clawing its way into my thoughts. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard a knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. I hesitated, wondering if I should just ignore it. But then I heard it again, more insistent this time. A sharp knock followed by a muffled sound, as though something was being slid under the door. I slowly got out of bed, my pulse quickening. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one in sight. The hallway was empty, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But then I looked down and saw a small, folded note resting on the floor. just barely visible under the crack of the door. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, hurried, and the words sent a chill straight to my core. "I know what you're doing." I stood there for a long moment, the note in my hand, my mind racing. Who could have left this? How did they know what I was doing? I hadn't told anyone about my late-night investigations into the scratching noises. The thought of someone watching me, someone who knew what I was doing in the privacy of my own apartment, sent a wave of nausea over me. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtains to see if anyone was lurking outside, but the street was empty. The apartment complex was dark, the only light coming from a few dim street lamps. There was no sign of anyone nearby. I closed the curtains and locked the window, my mind spinning. I went back to the door, checking the locks again, but everything seemed secure. I placed the note on the kitchen counter and tried to calm my racing thoughts. It had to be some kind of prank, I reasoned. Maybe one of the neighbors had slipped it under my door as a joke. But the more I thought about it, the more the words echoed in my mind. "I know what you're doing." And the scratching in the walls started again, louder this time, almost as if it were mocking me. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I grabbed my phone and texted a few friends, asking if anyone had been to my apartment recently. No one had. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the rest of the night pacing around my apartment, jumping at every little noise, every creak and groan of the building. The scratching grew more frantic, almost like something was clawing its way through the walls, trying to break free. I kept thinking about the note, about how it felt like a warning, like someone knew something I didn't. The next morning, I went to the building superintendent to ask about the noises. He was a gruff man, the kind of person who didn't like to be bothered with trivial concerns. He told me the building was old and that the pipes and wiring often made strange sounds. He seemed uninterested in my story, brushing it off as nothing more than the building settling. But I wasn't convinced. Something was wrong, and I knew it. That afternoon, I decided to do some research on the building. I dug through old property records, trying to find any history of strange occurrences or previous tenants. That's when I stumbled across something chilling. The apartment I was living in had a dark past. Years ago, a tenant had disappeared without a trace. No one knew what happened to them, and the case was never solved. I shuddered as I read the details. The last known communication from the tenant had been a note left on their door, just like mine. "I know what you're doing." I don't know who or what is in the walls of my apartment, but I know now that I'm not alone. The scratching is louder than ever, and I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever escape this place. The note was only the beginning. Story 5. I was driving home late one evening, the streets unusually quiet for the time of night. The only sounds were the hum of my car and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. As I glanced in my rearview mirror, I noticed a car several vehicles behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another late-night driver heading in the same direction. But then I made a turn onto a quieter street, and the car followed. It wasn't alarming at first, maybe it was just a coincidence. But as I made another turn, the car stayed right behind me, maintaining the same distance. I quickened my pace, making another sharp turn, hoping to lose whoever it was. But again the car followed, never closing the gap, but always there. A wave of unease began to creep over me. I couldn't explain why, but something about the situation felt wrong. The streets I was driving on were unfamiliar, and the feeling of being trailed by another car set my nerves on edge. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking it, but my grip on the steering wheel tightened as I made yet another turn, only to see the headlights of the car still following me. I decided to head home, hoping that whatever was going on would end once I reached my driveway. As I turned onto my street, I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Sure enough, the car followed me right up to my block. My heart began to race as I pulled into my driveway, hoping that the car would continue past. But to my growing anxiety, the car stopped across the street, its headlights remaining off. I could feel my pulse quicken as I sat in my car, staring at the figure across the street. The headlights of the car were off, and it remained perfectly still. The longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. The streetlights flickered above, casting eerie shadows across the road, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the car. It was as if it was waiting for something. I checked my rearview mirror, but there was no one behind me. I was alone now, except for the car across the street. I considered getting out and walking inside quickly, but the idea of leaving my car alone in the driveway made me hesitate. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me, a heavy sense of dread creeping up my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver lived nearby, and I hadn't noticed before. But that thought didn't sit right with me. It didn't explain why the car had followed me for so long or why it had stopped when I did. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was almost as if the person inside was studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. I decided to make a call, just to have some kind of safety net. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of a friend who lived a few blocks away. My fingers trembled as the phone rang, but it went straight to voicemail. I hung up quickly, my mind racing. I tried calling another friend, but the same thing happened. It was as if the night had swallowed up any chance of reaching someone. I thought about calling the police, but the car hadn't done anything overtly threatening. It was just sitting there, a stationary figure across the street. I didn't want to waste anyone's time if it turned out to be nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The car was watching me, and I was starting to feel like I was trapped in some kind of silent standoff. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the car's headlights flicker on, but instead of driving away, the car remained in place. I sat frozen in my seat, not knowing what to do next. My mind raced with possibilities. Was the driver waiting for me to leave the safety of my house? Or were they just trying to scare me? I couldn't be sure, but the feeling of being watched intensified with every passing second. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of my car's engine and the occasional rustling of leaves. I debated what to do next. I thought about getting out and rushing inside, but the idea of turning my back on the car made my stomach churn. I couldn't afford to be careless. Something told me that if I left my car alone, I might never see it again. Eventually, I made a decision. I couldn't stay out there all night staring at the car across the street. I would make a run for it. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever might happen, and quickly got out of my car. I locked the doors behind me, glancing nervously at the car as I made my way to the front door. As I reached for my keys, I heard the car engine roar to life. The headlights blazed, blinding me for a moment. My heart skipped a beat as the car suddenly sped down the street, turning the corner with surprising speed. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand still gripping the door handle. What had just happened? Why had the car left so suddenly? I didn't waste any time. I quickly unlocked the door and stepped inside, slamming it behind me. I checked the windows, peering through the blinds to see if the car had circled back, but there was no sign of it. The street outside was empty, eerily quiet once again. I spent the rest of the night awake, the unsettling feeling never fully leaving me. The car had followed me, stopped across the street, and then disappeared just as quickly as it had come. But even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning I checked the street, but there was no sign of the car, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't forget it. Something about that car and the way it had watched me stayed with me long after the night had passed. Story 6. I went on a solo hike in the woods, trying to escape the stress of life. The fresh air, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and the solitude of the forest were all I needed to clear my mind. It had been a rough few weeks, and I was desperate for some peace. I had planned this hike for days, choosing a quiet trail that wound through the trees, far from the bustle of everyday life. At first, everything was perfect. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the trail. I walked at a steady pace, my thoughts drifting with the rhythm of my steps. But then, something made me pause. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the unease gnawed at me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the quiet of the woods playing tricks on my mind. I continued walking, but the sensation didn't fade. Minutes passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I looked behind me, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. But there was something about the stillness that made my skin crawl. The forest was too quiet now, and I felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but my instincts told me otherwise. The next time I turned around, I saw a figure just out of sight, hidden between the trees. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the shape was too real to ignore. A person, or something resembling one, was keeping pace with me, moving in and out of view. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood my veins. I picked up my pace, hoping the figure would disappear, but it didn't. The footsteps behind me grew louder, as if someone was walking in perfect sync with my every move. I couldn't bring myself to look again, but the sound of them was unmistakable. My breathing quickened, and my legs felt heavy, like they were moving through molasses. I pushed myself harder, willing my body to move faster, but the footsteps kept up with me, never faltering, never slowing. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure, or whatever it was, matched my pace, moving with eerie precision. I glanced over my shoulder once more, but all I saw was the blur of trees and shadows. It was as if the forest itself had become a maze, and the path I was on had no end. The sound of footsteps behind me grew faster, matching my speed, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and confront whatever was following me. I ran harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods, once peaceful, now felt like a trap, a place where the trees themselves were closing in on me. I could feel the weight of the figure behind me, its presence looming just out of sight, like a shadow I couldn't escape. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it a person, an animal, or something else entirely, something that belonged to the dark, hidden places of the woods? I stumbled over a root, catching myself just before I fell. The sound of the footsteps never wavered, though. They were closer now, almost too close, as if the figure was right behind me, just out of reach. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself to my limits, my legs screaming in protest. I had to get away. I had to escape. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trail winding through the trees in endless loops. My mind was clouded with fear, my thoughts jumbled and disjointed. I couldn't remember how long I had been running, but the footsteps never stopped. It was as if the figure was feeding off my fear, drawing closer with every step I took. I glanced over my shoulder once more, my breath hitching in my throat. There, just at the edge of my vision, I saw the outline of the figure. It was taller than any person I had seen, its shape twisted and distorted like something unnatural. It moved with an eerie fluidity, its steps synchronized with mine, as if it was part of the forest itself. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I knew I couldn't keep running forever. The woods seemed to close in on me, the trees growing thicker, the air heavier. I was lost, disoriented, and the sound of the footsteps was the only thing I could focus on. I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me as I fell to the ground. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I dared to look up, my body trembling with fear. But the figure was gone. There was no sign of it, no movement in the shadows. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined a ball. I sat there on the forest floor, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I didn't stay long. The moment I found the strength to stand, I turned and began walking in the opposite direction, hoping to find my way back to the trailhead. The feeling of being watched never left me, though. It lingered, a cold presence that clung to the air around me. I couldn't shake the image of the figure or the sound of its footsteps forever echoing in my mind. When I finally made it back to my car, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The woods stood silent, untouched, but the memory of the unseen watcher remained. I didn't know what it was or why it had followed me, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to those woods again. Story 7. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed the camera. I had just come home from work and was unpacking my things when I glanced out the window and saw a small black device attached to the corner of the building across from mine. It was positioned perfectly, angled toward my apartment window. At first, I thought it was some sort of security camera installed by the building, but something about it felt off. It seemed too focused, too deliberate. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, maybe a neighbor's security system, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. I had lived in this apartment for almost a year, and I had never seen anything like this before. The camera was small, sleek, and black, with a lens that seemed to be staring directly at me. I kept thinking about it as I went about my evening, the image of that unblinking eye lingering in the back of my mind. The next morning, I decided to bring it up to my landlord. I wasn't sure why, but something told me I needed to address it. When I arrived at the office, I mentioned the camera and asked if it was something they had installed. My landlord, a middle-aged man named Greg, looked at me with a blank expression before shaking his head. "No, that's not one of ours," he said. "We don't put cameras on the exterior of the building. You must be mistaken." His dismissive tone made me feel like I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, I took a walk around the building to see if I could get a better look at the camera. As I rounded the corner, I saw it again, positioned on the second floor of the building across the street. This time, I noticed a small sticker on the side of the camera. It was too far away for me to read clearly, but the sticker seemed like a clue. I snapped a quick photo with my phone, hoping I could zoom in on it later. The more I thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. I was sure the camera had nothing to do with the building's security system. I decided to do some investigating. The next day, I asked a few neighbors if they had noticed the camera. Most of them shrugged it off, saying they hadn't seen anything unusual. But one of my neighbors, an older woman who lived a few doors down, seemed a little more concerned when I mentioned it. "Oh, I've seen that camera," she said, her voice low. "It's been there for a while now. I don't know who put it there, but it's been pointed at your apartment for weeks. "I've noticed it too." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I had been so caught up in my own life that I hadn't even thought to ask if anyone else had seen it. I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that someone had been watching me. I kept thinking about the strange way the camera was positioned, always pointing directly at my window. It was as if whoever had put it there knew exactly when I would be home, knew exactly where to focus it. I tried to brush off the feeling, but it lingered. I had no idea who could be behind it, but I was starting to feel paranoid. The next evening I went out for a walk, hoping some fresh air would help clear my mind. As I walked past the building with the camera, I saw a man standing near the window on the second floor, his face barely visible through the curtains. He seemed to be looking right at me. I froze, my heart racing. Was he the one who had installed the camera? Had he been watching me all this time? I quickly turned away, my footsteps quickening as I hurried back to my apartment. That night, I decided to take action. I contacted the police and explained the situation. They seemed skeptical at first, but I was persistent. I told them about the camera, the way it had been pointed directly at my window, and the strange feeling I had that someone was spying on me. The officer I spoke to told me they would look into it, but I wasn't sure if they would take it seriously. It wasn't like someone had broken into my apartment or threatened me directly, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The next day I received a call from the police. They told me they had identified the owner of the camera. It turned out the camera belonged to the neighbor in the apartment directly across from mine. His name was John, and he had been living in the building for a few years. The police said they had spoken to him, and he had admitted to installing the camera. Apparently, he had been spying on me for weeks. I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I had been right all along. The camera wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't some random security device. It was a deliberate act of invasion. The police informed me that they had taken the camera and were investigating further, but they reassured me that I was safe. I wasn't sure if I felt relieved or more unsettled by the whole situation. When I confronted John, he was oddly calm about the whole thing. He didn't seem remorseful, just matter of fact. "I thought you were interesting," he said, his voice flat. "I've been watching you for a while. You never noticed, did you?" I was speechless. I had never felt so violated in my life. The fact that he had been watching me, probably even when I was unaware, made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream at him, but instead I just turned and walked away, not knowing what else to say. The police told me they would take appropriate action, but John was allowed to stay in the building. I couldn't help but feel unsafe, knowing that he was still living just a few feet away from me. I made sure to change my routine, locking my windows and blinds at all times, and I reported everything to my landlord. They promised to look into the situation, but the damage had already been done. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for far too long, and I didn't know if I could ever feel truly safe again. Story 8. I was stuck in traffic on the highway, the usual frustration settling in as I inched forward. The cars ahead of me barely moved, and the honking from behind only added to my irritation. As I sat there, I glanced around to pass the time, but my attention was caught by a car that suddenly pulled up beside me. The vehicle was a dark sedan, sleek and nondescript, but it was the driver who grabbed my attention. He was staring directly at me, his eyes fixed with an intensity that sent an odd shiver down my spine. I couldn't look away, even though something in the back of my mind told me I should. The seconds felt like minutes as I sat frozen, unsure of what to do. The driver didn't blink, didn't even move his head, just kept his gaze locked on me. My heart began to race, and a feeling of unease crept over me. What was this person doing? Why was he staring at me so intently? The traffic finally began to move, and I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the escape. But as the cars around me started to pick up speed, the sedan sped off, disappearing into the distance. I shook off the feeling, thinking it was nothing more than an odd coincidence. A few minutes later, I passed a rest stop off to the side of the highway. It wasn't a large stop, just a small place where travelers could stretch their legs and grab a quick snack. I didn't need to stop, but as I glanced toward the parking lot, I froze. There, parked in one of the spaces, was the same dark sedan. The driver was nowhere to be seen, but the car was unmistakable. It was the same one that had been beside me in traffic just moments ago. My stomach twisted with unease, and the strange sensation of being watched began to settle in. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that it was just a coincidence. There were plenty of dark sedans on the road, and I had no reason to assume the driver was following me. Still, as I continued down the highway, my mind kept drifting back to the encounter. What were the odds that I would see the same car again so soon? I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the sedan trailing me, but there was nothing. Just the usual stream of cars behind me, nothing out of the ordinary. I let out a quiet breath, telling myself I was overreacting. But as I drove further, the nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. I turned onto a quieter stretch of road, the scenery becoming more desolate, and I found myself constantly checking my mirrors. The highway was relatively empty now, and I felt an increasing sense of isolation. It was as though I was the only one on the road, and that dark sedan had vanished from my mind until I saw it again. I glanced to my right and saw the same sedan, parked at the side of the road near an abandoned gas station. The sight made my heart race. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. The car had appeared in the same place at the same time, like it was following me. I wasn't sure if I was just paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I had now seen it 3 times. I quickly turned my attention back to the road, trying to focus on driving, but my thoughts kept drifting to the driver, to that unsettling stare. Was he following me? Why? I decided to pull into a nearby rest area to clear my head. I needed to take a break anyway, but my main goal was to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I parked my car in a well-lit spot and sat for a moment, trying to steady my nerves. I glanced around, noticing the few other cars scattered around the lot, but none of them looked like the sedan. Still, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that the driver was out there, waiting. I took a deep breath and tried to push the thought from my mind. As I stepped out of my car, I stretched my legs and walked to the small convenience store nearby. The lights inside flickered, casting strange shadows along the aisles. I quickly grabbed a bottle of water and paid, but as I walked back to my car, I felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. I turned my head instinctively, my pulse quickening. There, at the far end of the parking lot, was the same dark sedan, parked just outside the lot's exit. The driver wasn't inside, but the car was unmistakable. My heart dropped into my stomach. I hurried back to my car, locking the doors as I climbed in. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I just imagining things? Was I overreacting to an innocent series of events? Or was there something more sinister at play? I had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I drove off, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, but there was no sign of the sedan. It wasn't behind me, at least not yet. I drove for miles, taking turns and exits, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. The road was empty now, just me and the headlights of my car. But the tension in my chest remained, and every shadow seemed to hold the possibility of that dark sedan lurking just out of sight. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was watching me, tracking my every move. The thought made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Eventually, I reached a small town and decided to stop at a gas station to fuel up. As I pulled into the lot, I looked around, half expecting to see the sedan, but there was no sign of it. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself that maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just stressed out, overthinking things. But as I stepped out of the car to pay for the gas, I noticed something in the distance, a dark sedan, parked at the far end of the lot, its headlights off. The driver wasn't inside, but the car was unmistakable. And this time I didn't need to look over my shoulder to know that I was being stalked. Story 9. I came home after a long day at work, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. The familiar sight of my front porch greeted me, but there was something unusual about it. On the doorstep next to the mat sat a small, unmarked package. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I had ordered something I forgot about, but there was no label, no indication of who it was from. I crouched down to pick it up, the cardboard box light in my hands. The first thing that struck me was the lack of any return address or writing, just my name neatly printed on the front in black ink. A chill ran through me as I wondered who could have left it here. My neighborhood was quiet, but it wasn't uncommon for packages to be left by delivery drivers. Still, something about this one felt different. As I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I set the package down on the kitchen table. The unease that had settled in my stomach grew as I carefully peeled back the tape and opened the box. Inside was a single photograph, slightly creased at the edges, and a folded note beneath it. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at the photo. It was of me walking into my house earlier that day. The picture was taken from an angle I hadn't noticed, as though someone had been standing across the street, watching me. I felt a wave of panic rise within me. How could someone have taken that photo? I had been alone, walking into my house, not thinking about anyone following me. I scanned the photo for any clues, maybe a car in the background, or someone standing in the distance, but there was nothing. Just me coming home like I always did. I quickly reached for the note, unfolding it with trembling hands. The words on the paper were simple, but the impact was immediate. "I'm watching." My breath caught in my throat as I read the sentence again. It felt like a punch to the gut. The note was short, but it was enough to send my mind spiraling into a whirlwind of possibilities. Who was watching me? Why had they sent this? And how had they known where I was earlier today? I stood frozen for a moment, the photo still in my hands. The weight of it was suffocating, the feeling of being watched pressing down on me like a physical force. I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been in my neighborhood, following me without my knowledge. The image of the photograph, the angle, the timing felt too precise to be a coincidence. It was as though they had been waiting for the exact moment I entered my house. I walked to the window and peered outside, scanning the street for any sign of movement. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, but everything seemed normal. No one was standing across the street. No cars were parked in front of my house. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, hidden in the shadows just out of sight. I backed away from the window, my heart racing as I tried to calm my nerves. My mind raced with questions. Had I been followed? Was someone lurking nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike? I considered calling the police, but what could I even say? I had no evidence, just a photograph and a cryptic note. It wasn't enough to go on, not really. Still, the sense of danger that had taken root in my chest was impossible to ignore. I couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for the police, trying to keep my voice steady. After explaining the situation, The dispatcher assured me they would send someone to check the area, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. The conversation left me feeling more isolated, more helpless. The photo in my hands was a silent reminder that someone out there knew things they shouldn't. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't stop myself from looking at the photo again. The more I stared at it, the more unsettling it became. It was like a puzzle I couldn't solve, each new detail adding to the mystery. I tried to think back to the day to recall if anything had seemed out of place, but nothing stood out. I had just gone about my usual routine, nothing unusual happening. But now, with this photograph in my hands, it was like the entire day had been overshadowed by something sinister. The house felt unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making every small sound seem louder. I went through the house, checking all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. It felt like a pointless exercise, as if locking the doors would somehow make me feel safer. But it didn't. The feeling of being watched lingered heavy in the air, and I couldn't escape it. As night settled in, I sat in the living room, the photograph still on the coffee table in front of me. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, to pretend it hadn't happened. It felt like a warning, a message that I couldn't ignore. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone I knew? Someone from my past, maybe? The idea that it could be a stranger, someone with no connection to me, felt even more terrifying. How had they found me? How long had they been watching? Hours passed, and still there was no sign of anyone outside. The police hadn't found anything unusual, no strange cars parked nearby, no footprints or evidence of someone lurking around. But the absence of proof didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made me feel more vulnerable, as though the person behind the photo had covered their tracks too well. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside, made my heart race. I kept thinking about the words on the note. I'm watching. It was simple, but it carried an ominous weight. The fear gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent the package was still out there, watching, waiting for the next move. And I had no idea what that move would be. Story 10. Every day, like clockwork, he appeared. A man in a dark coat, always sitting at the same table in the corner of the cafe. His eyes never left me, even as I moved around the small, bustling space, taking orders and serving drinks. I had worked at this cafe for nearly 6 months, and at first, I had thought little of him, just another regular customer, I assumed. But over time, his presence became unnerving, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. At first, it was easy to dismiss his staring as nothing more than a quirk, but as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. His gaze was always fixed on me, unblinking, even as I served other customers. I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of discomfort, like he was watching my every move, memorizing my routine. When I would catch his eye, he'd smile, but it was never a warm smile, more like a knowing, unsettling grin. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. But no matter how much I tried to ignore him, he remained a constant fixture in my daily life. I mentioned it to a few of my coworkers, but they just shrugged it off, saying he was harmless, just another odd regular. They told me I was overthinking things, that I should focus on my job and not let it get to me. But every time I saw him sitting there, his eyes fixed on me, it felt like he was waiting for something. The cafe was small, cozy even, and the tables were arranged so that no one could sit too far from the counter. I always knew when he was there because the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. I couldn't escape his gaze, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. I found myself looking over my shoulder, even when I wasn't at work, wondering if he was somewhere nearby watching. One evening, As the cafe was winding down and the last few customers were finishing their meals, I noticed him sitting at his usual spot. He was the only one left in the cafe, and the empty room made the silence between us feel even more oppressive. His gaze was fixed on me as always, but tonight there was something different about it. His smile seemed wider, almost too wide, as if he were savoring something, waiting for the right moment. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to know what he wanted, why he had been following me, why he never left me alone. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. I walked over to his table, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't look up when I approached, as if he already knew I was coming. The cafe was nearly empty now, and the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant clinking of cups only added to the tension in the air. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound confident. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly looked up at me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. There was a glint in his gaze, something cold and predatory, and for a moment, I felt like I was being trapped in a web I couldn't escape. He smiled, that same unnerving grin, and I felt my stomach drop. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, his voice low and almost too calm. The words sent a chill down my spine. I froze, unsure of what to say next. Was he threatening me? Or was this some strange, twisted joke? I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it felt like it had lodged itself there, making it impossible to breathe. "Waiting for me?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky. "What do you mean by that?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. It looked old, the edges of the pages frayed and yellowed. He placed it on the table in front of him, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt a strange compulsion to look at it, but I forced myself to look away, my mind racing with questions. "I have been watching you for a long time," he said, his voice now a little louder, as if he were sharing a secret. "I know everything about you. Your habits, your routines. I know when you take your lunch breaks, when you leave work, and when you walk home at night." My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart racing. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He chuckled softly, the sound low and dark, as though he found my fear amusing. "I don't want anything," he said, his tone almost gentle. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I was here, waiting for you, for when the time is right." I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. Was this some kind of game? Was he just trying to scare me? I took another step back, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to provoke him any further. I needed to get away, to leave the cafe before things escalated anymore. "I'm leaving now," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't follow me." He didn't respond, but his eyes never left me as I quickly walked toward the door. I glanced back just as I reached for the handle, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something different in his eyes, something almost sad, as if he were disappointed that I was leaving. But then he smiled again, that same eerie smile, and I hurried out into the night, my pulse racing. The following days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even though I never saw him again. The cafe felt different now, as though the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't go back to the table where he had sat, couldn't stand the thought of him being near me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget his words. "I've been waiting for you." Story 11. It was a quiet afternoon when I checked my mailbox, expecting the usual bills and junk mail. But among the pile of envelopes was one that stood out. It was an unmarked envelope, its edges worn as though it had traveled a long distance. The absence of a return address sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off as another oddity in a world full of strange occurrences. I stood there for a moment, staring at the envelope, unsure whether to open it. The handwriting on the front was messy, almost frantic, but the familiar motion of tearing open the envelope felt like a normal thing to do. I pulled out the letter, unfolded it, and started reading. At first, the words didn't register. They seemed almost nonsensical, like they were written in haste, but then the content began to make sense, and it made my stomach drop. The letter was a detailed description of my routine. It mentioned the time I woke up, how I walked to my car, and even the route I took to work. It talked about the cafe where I stopped for coffee every morning, the small park I passed on my way home, and the corner store where I picked up my groceries. Each line seemed to pinpoint specific moments in my life, things that no one else could possibly know unless they were watching me, following me. I read the letter again, my heart racing now. How could someone know so much about my daily routine? I didn't recognize the handwriting, and the letter didn't mention anything personal, nothing that would have given me any clue as to who might be behind it. It was simply a report of my life, a chronicle of my every move. As I continued reading, I reached the last line, and it froze me in place. "I'm closer than you think." I stood motionless for a few seconds, the words echoing in my mind. I looked at the letter again, searching for any hidden clues or details that might point to the person who sent it. But there was nothing. The letter was simply a message, and its meaning hung heavy in the air. "I'm closer than you think." The sentence was like a warning, but a warning about what? Who? And how close were they, exactly? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a prank, a cruel joke from someone who had been watching me for some time. But the thought didn't bring me comfort. What bothered me more was the sense of familiarity the letter conveyed. It wasn't just random information, it was specific, personal. Whoever wrote it knew exactly who I was and what I did every day. I began to feel paranoid, like I was being watched from somewhere just beyond my sight. I locked the door and sat down on the couch, staring at the letter in my hands. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably nothing, just a misguided attempt at spooking me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The tone of the letter was too unsettling, too deliberate. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a message. A message from someone who was watching me, someone who knew far too much about me. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing out the window, checking the street for any signs of movement. My every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The letter sat on the coffee table, its words burned into my mind. I tried to reach out to friends and family, hoping they would offer some explanation or comfort, but everyone was either too busy or didn't take me seriously. "It's probably just a prank," my best friend said when I told her about the letter. "People do weird stuff all the time. Maybe it's just some bored person who thought they'd mess with you." But her words didn't help. The feeling of being watched never left. I spent the next few days feeling on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if I was being followed. I changed up my routine, tried to be more aware of my surroundings, but the unease only grew. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, knowing my every move. Then, a week later, I received another letter. The envelope was just as plain as the first, and the handwriting was just as messy. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting the worst. This time the letter was shorter, but the message was clear. "I see you. I'm always watching." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. This wasn't a joke anymore. Someone was keeping track of me, following me, and they weren't going to stop. The words "I'm closer than you think" echoed in my mind, louder now than ever before. How close were they? Where were they? Were they really watching me right now, standing just outside my window or lurking in the shadows? I didn't know who to turn to for help. I called the police, but they seemed dismissive, saying there was nothing they could do unless I had more concrete evidence. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. No matter where I went, I felt eyes on me, and the letters kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. I started to second-guess every decision I made. I stopped going to the places I usually frequented, hoping it would throw off whoever was following me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, just beyond my reach, always watching, always waiting. The letters never stopped. They continued to arrive, each one more intimate, more detailed than the last. The sense of being hunted grew stronger with each passing day, and I began to question whether I would ever feel safe again. The message was clear, and the person behind it wasn't going to stop until they were standing right in front of me. Story 12. It was well past midnight when the knock came. I was just about to drift off to sleep, the quiet of the night surrounding me, when the sound of 3 sharp raps on the door startled me awake. My first instinct was to ignore it, thinking it might be a neighbor or someone who had the wrong address. But the knocks continued, persistent and insistent. I sighed, rolling out of bed and walking to the door, wondering who could possibly be at my door at this hour. When I opened it, I was surprised to find a delivery man standing there, holding a small, brown package. He looked ordinary enough, wearing a dark jacket with the logo of a delivery company emblazoned on it. His expression was unreadable, and he didn't speak right away. Instead, he simply held the package out to me, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. I was still groggy, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't recall ordering anything," I said, my voice sounding thick from sleep. The delivery man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the package in his hands. I repeated myself, asking who had sent it, but he only gave me a quick glance before shrugging and saying, "It's for you." He didn't offer any more information, and before I could ask another question, he turned on his heel and walked away without another word. I stood there in the doorway, bewildered. The cold air from the hallway seeped into my apartment, making me shiver slightly as I looked at the package in my hands. It wasn't a large package, more of a medium-sized box wrapped in plain brown paper. But there was no label or return address to identify its sender. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to figure out what was going on. Had someone sent me a gift, or was this a mistake? And why had the delivery man been so cryptic? I closed the door, feeling a strange sense of unease settle over me. I placed the package on the kitchen table, but I didn't open it right away. The whole situation felt off. Why would someone send me a package without any explanation? And why had the delivery man acted so strange? I kept thinking about how he hadn't said a word beyond "it's for you" and then left without so much as a goodbye. It was like he didn't want to engage in any conversation. After a few minutes, I decided to take a closer look at the package. It was wrapped tightly, with a piece of brown tape sealing it shut. I could feel the weight of it, and it was slightly heavier than I had expected. But despite my curiosity, I hesitated. It was odd, sure, but there didn't seem to be anything dangerous about it. I grabbed a pair of scissors from the drawer and carefully cut the tape, slowly peeling away the paper. Inside, I found a small, neatly wrapped box, nothing too fancy, just a simple cardboard container. I opened the box and found it empty. My stomach dropped. The inside of the box was completely hollow, save for a small slip of paper at the bottom. I picked it up carefully, unfolding it to reveal a cryptic message scrawled in black ink. "I'm always watching." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. What was this supposed to mean? Who had sent it, and why? I stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, holding the message in my hand, my thoughts racing. There was no return address on the package, no clue as to who had sent it. The delivery man's behavior suddenly seemed even more unsettling. It was as if the whole thing had been orchestrated to confuse and frighten me. But by who and why? I didn't know what to do next. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't have much to go on. There was no physical evidence of anything suspicious other than the mysterious package and its cryptic message. I tried to calm myself down, reminding myself that it could be a prank. But the thought that someone might be watching me, someone who knew where I lived, someone who had been keeping tabs on me, sent a wave of anxiety through me. After a long while of pacing, trying to figure out what to do, I decided to try to get some sleep. The package and the message still weighed heavily on my mind, but I couldn't keep myself awake any longer. I needed to rest, to clear my head. I placed the box on the kitchen counter and went back to bed, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. When I woke up the next morning, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The air felt colder than usual, and the apartment seemed eerily silent. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, and then froze. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar. I had clearly remembered locking it before going to sleep, but now it was open, just a crack. My heart began to race as I rushed to the door, pushing it open fully and peering into the hallway. There was no one there. The hallway was quiet, just as it had been when I had gone to bed. But the door was definitely open, and I could have sworn I had locked it. I stepped back inside, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? Or had someone opened it while I was sleeping? The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. I checked the rest of the apartment, my eyes darting from room to room, looking for any sign that something had been tampered with. Everything seemed normal, but the sense of dread in my gut grew stronger with each passing second. What had happened while I slept? Had someone been in my apartment? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to the package from the night before. The cryptic message, the strange delivery, and now the door being left open. Everything seemed like part of a much larger puzzle that I couldn't solve. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a coincidence, that I was overthinking things, but I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that I was being watched. As the day went on, I kept looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the sense that someone was out there, observing me from the shadows. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone in this apartment anymore. And whatever game this was, it was only just beginning. Story 13. For the past few days, there had been a car parked outside my house. At first, I thought it was a visitor from one of the neighboring houses, maybe a friend or relative coming over for a few days. It wasn't unusual to see unfamiliar cars parked along the street. But something about this car felt off, and the longer it stayed, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong. The car was a dusty blue sedan, nothing particularly special about it. It wasn't flashy or out of place in the neighborhood, but the longer I saw it, the more out of place it seemed. It was parked in front of my house, and each time I left or came home, it was still there. No one was ever around it. No one got in or out. I couldn't even recall seeing anyone near it at all. By the third day, the car's presence started to weigh on me. I started wondering who it belonged to and why it was parked there for so long without any sign of movement. Was it abandoned? Had someone broken down and left it there? I tried to reason with myself, but the more I thought about it, the less comfortable I felt. There was something unsettling about it, like it was being purposefully left there to watch the house. Curiosity got the better of me, and one afternoon I decided to take a closer look. I walked up to the car and peered through the windows, hoping to get some clue as to who might own it. The interior was relatively clean, but there were no personal items visible. No bags, no papers, not even a hint of who might have been inside. It was just an empty car, sitting there like it was waiting for something. I checked the license plate next. At first glance, it didn't look unusual, but I noticed the plate wasn't one I recognized. Most cars in the area had plates from our state, but this one had an out-of-state plate. That wasn't uncommon, but it still struck me as odd. I decided to take down the number and do a quick online search, but when I entered it into the system, I was shocked to find that it wasn't registered. There was no record of the plate at all. My mind began to race. A car without a registered license plate? That didn't make any sense. We could have been stolen. I stood there for a moment, trying to piece everything together. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Why would someone park an unregistered car outside my house? And why would they leave it for days without anyone coming near it? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stood there for a while, trying to see if anyone would approach the car. The street was relatively quiet, with only a few cars passing by, but no one seemed to pay any attention to the strange vehicle. It just sat there, as still as ever. I decided to go back inside and keep an eye on it, hoping that I could make sense of what was going on. Over the next few days, the car remained parked outside my house. I found myself obsessively checking out the window every time I passed by. It was like a constant presence, always there, just outside my line of sight. I started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched, but I couldn't figure out who would be watching me or why. I even asked a few neighbors if they had seen the car or knew who it belonged to, but they hadn't noticed anything unusual. The strangest part was that no one had approached the car. No one had tried to drive it away or check on it. It was as though the car had been abandoned and left to just sit there, unnoticed by anyone except me. The mystery only deepened as I couldn't stop thinking about it, and the unease grew with each passing day. Then, one morning, I woke up and looked out the window to see the car was gone. I wasn't sure when it had left, but the spot where it had been parked was now empty. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It was as if the car had vanished into thin air, just as mysteriously as it had appeared. I checked the street, hoping to see some trace of the car, maybe parked nearby or down the block, but there was nothing. It was like it had never been there at all. I even checked the spot where it had been parked, hoping to find a clue or some sign that it had been moved, but there was nothing. It was as though it had simply disappeared. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just a random car that had been abandoned and towed away or driven off by someone who had finally come for it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. It was a feeling that lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me long after the car was gone. The unregistered license plate, the empty interior, and the way it had appeared out of nowhere, it all felt too strange to be a coincidence. Over time, I managed to push the memory of the car to the back of my mind, but it's never truly left me. I still wonder who owned that car and why it appeared outside my house. Was it a random occurrence, or was I being targeted for some reason I couldn't understand? Every so often I'll glance at the street, half expecting to see that same blue sedan parked outside again. But it never returns, and I'm left with only the strange memory of its brief, inexplicable presence. Story 14. I stepped into the elevator at work, the doors sliding closed behind me with a soft chime. The elevator was empty. just the hum of the lights and the quiet buzz of the air conditioning. I pressed the button for my floor, casually glancing at the floor indicators. Then, a man entered the elevator just as the doors were about to close. He was tall, wearing a plain gray suit, his face unreadable. I didn't recognize him, and there was something unsettling about the way he moved. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. He stood next to me without saying a word, not even a glance in my direction. His presence felt heavier than it should have been, and I shifted uncomfortably, but tried to shrug it off. As the elevator ascended, I couldn't help but notice how the man didn't press any buttons. He didn't make a sound, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I was there. He stood perfectly still, hands at his side, staring ahead at the metal doors without blinking. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, wondering if he was waiting for someone else to enter. But no one else did. The elevator reached my floor, and I heard the familiar chime signaling the stop. I glanced at the man, hoping to make some small talk, or at least acknowledge him, but he didn't move. His body remained stiff, almost unnaturally so. I raised my eyebrows, confused. Was he stuck? Did he not realize we had reached a floor? I stepped toward the doors, ready to exit, but I paused for a second, looking back at the man. He hadn't shifted an inch. It was as if he hadn't noticed the elevator had stopped or simply didn't care. I cleared my throat and softly said, "Excuse me, are you getting off?" He didn't respond. There was no reaction from him at all, no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no sign that he even heard me. He simply continued to stare at the elevator doors, his face a mask of complete indifference. My pulse quickened as an odd sense of unease washed over me. Why wouldn't he acknowledge me? I pushed the button for the door to open again, but it didn't work. The doors remained firmly shut. I pressed the button multiple times, trying to get the elevator to function normally, but it was as if the man's presence had frozen everything. A strange, suffocating silence filled the small space. I had never felt so trapped in an elevator before. I turned back to the man, my voice wavering as I spoke again. "Hey, are you okay?" I wanted to shake him, to get some kind of response, but I was frozen too, caught in his unblinking gaze. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I was dealing with something far beyond an ordinary elevator ride. There was something wrong with him, something wrong with this situation. Still no response. It was as though he didn't even hear me. His expression was frozen, his features locked in a neutral mask. I reached for the emergency button, my hand trembling as I pressed it. The soft beep filled the quiet space, but the doors didn't open. The elevator wasn't moving, and neither was he. For a moment I considered just getting off the elevator anyway, hoping it would start moving on its own. But as I looked at the man once again, something told me I needed to stay. I wanted to walk out and forget all about this, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible would happen if I did. I cleared my throat again and said, louder this time, "Sir, please. Are you okay?" My voice was now tinged with a mixture of frustration and fear. He still didn't flinch, didn't move. He simply stood there, staring ahead, as if the world around him didn't exist. I took a step toward him, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The instant my fingers brushed against his suit, my heart stopped. The fabric felt cold, unnaturally so. He felt like a mannequin, stiff and unyielding. I quickly withdrew my hand, horrified by the sensation. Suddenly, the elevator doors opened with a jolt, and I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. The moment the doors slid open, I felt a rush of cold air, like something had just shifted. I looked down the hallway, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the floor was empty. No one else had gotten on or off. I glanced back at the man who still hadn't moved. But now, as I looked at him one last time, a chill ran down my spine. His eyes were locked onto me, and for the first time since stepping into the elevator, I saw the faintest flicker of something in them, a glimmer of recognition. But before I could process it, I turned and bolted out of the elevator, not daring to look back. I rushed to the nearest stairwell and quickly climbed the steps, feeling a cold sweat prickling across my skin. What had just happened? Who was that man? Why hadn't he moved or said anything? As I reached my office, I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it lingered like a shadow, following me through the day. I found myself glancing at the elevators whenever they dinged, waiting to see if the man would step out or if anyone else had seen him. But no one mentioned anything, and there were no reports of strange behavior. I tried to convince myself it was just a weird, unsettling moment. Maybe the man had been lost in thought or too tired to notice me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That elevator ride hadn't been ordinary, and I couldn't shake the image of the silent man frozen in place, his eyes always watching me, even as I ran away. Story 15. I was working late in my office, the dim lights casting long shadows across the room. The building had emptied out hours ago, and the only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the occasional tap of my fingers on the keyboard. I had grown used to the solitude of late nights at the office, but tonight something felt different. The air was thick with a strange tension I couldn't shake off, and I found myself glancing around more often than usual. As I focused on my work, trying to push the unease aside, I suddenly heard a knock on my office door. It was sharp and deliberate, but there was no mistaking the oddity of it. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, and for a moment, I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had made sure to finish everything on my list before everyone else left. My mind raced through possible explanations, but none of them made sense. I hesitated before walking over to the door. The knock hadn't been a mistake or an accidental sound, it had been too precise. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the doorknob, and I quickly opened it, half expecting to find someone standing there with a simple explanation. But when I swung the door open, there was no one in the hallway. The corridor stretched on, empty and silent, just like the rest of the building. My heart rate increased, and I stepped into the hallway, peering around the corner, but there was nothing. I closed the door and stood there for a few moments, trying to shake off the unease that settled in my chest. Maybe it was just the building settling, or perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me after hours of staring at the computer screen. I couldn't afford to waste time on irrational fears. I returned to my desk, determined to finish my work without letting my imagination get the best of me. But just as I started to settle back into my chair, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting it to be an email notification or a spam call, but there was no name or number displayed, just an unknown call. My brow furrowed as I picked up the phone, still unsure of what to make of the situation. I pressed the receiver to my ear, and that's when I heard it. A knock. The same sharp, distinct sound that had echoed through the hallway moments before. The knock seemed to be coming from the phone speaker, as though someone was knocking directly on the other side of the line. I froze, the phone still pressed against my ear, the knock ringing out again, just as loud and clear as before. It felt as if the sound was coming from inside my own office, as if the knocking had somehow transferred from the hallway to the phone line. My pulse quickened, and my thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to materialize from the shadows, but there was no one. Just the same empty office, with the same oppressive silence surrounding me. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. How was this even possible? No one had been in the hallway, and no one had knocked on the door. Yet the sound was unmistakable, as if whoever had knocked was now standing right next to me, their presence looming in the room. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I quickly hung up the phone, the receiver clattering back into its cradle. But the sound of the knock lingered in my ears, echoing through the silence. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should I leave? Should I call someone? The phone call had shaken me, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it was anything more than a coincidence. It was just too strange, too unreal. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept returning to that knock, to the sound that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. I decided to take a break, step away from the desk for a moment. The hallway outside my office was still empty, the lights overhead flickering slightly. I walked over to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I waited for the elevator doors to open, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway remained as empty as ever. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped inside, feeling a slight sense of relief as the doors slid shut behind me. I pressed the button for the ground floor, telling myself that I just needed a break to clear my head. As the elevator descended, I found myself replaying the events of the night in my mind. What had really happened? Was it just a trick of the mind, a simple mistake, or was there something more to the knock, to the strange phone call that followed? The elevator doors opened, and I stepped out into the quiet lobby. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had taken hold of me. But as I turned to head back to the office, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a knock. It wasn't from the door to my office. It wasn't from the phone. It was coming from the lobby. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the lobby was still empty. There was no one in sight, and yet the sound was unmistakable. I turned toward the hallway, where the knocking seemed to be coming from. It was faint, but it was there, echoing in the silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. I stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. But there was no logical explanation for any of it. No one had been in the hallway. No one had been in the office. And yet, the knocks continued. I slowly walked back to my office, my thoughts a blur. As I opened the door, the familiar hum of the lights and the quiet emptiness of the room greeted me. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The office didn't feel quite the same. There was something else there now, something I couldn't explain. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to hear the next knock. Story 16. I was walking home from the grocery store, the weight of my bags pressing down on my shoulders. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. It was the kind of evening where everything felt still, almost too still. As I turned onto my street, I noticed a young child standing at the edge of the sidewalk. The child was alone, their small frame silhouetted by the fading light. They looked lost, their big eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. I approached them slowly, unsure of what to say, but then the child looked up at me and spoke. "Excuse me, can you help me find my parents?" Their voice was soft, almost a whisper. I couldn't help but feel a sense of concern wash over me. I looked around, but there were no other people in sight. The street was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "Where did you last see them?" The child looked down at their bare feet and shuffled nervously. I don't know, they said. I was walking, and then I couldn't find them anymore. I glanced down at the child's feet, noticing they were completely bare. There was no sign of shoes or socks, and the pavement beneath them was rough and cold. I couldn't understand how they had gotten so far without shoes, especially considering the chill in the air. I felt a pang of unease, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that maybe they had wandered off from a nearby house. "Well, don't worry," I said, trying to ease the situation. "Let's find your parents. Do you know where you live?" The child's gaze lifted to meet mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in their eyes, something familiar, yet strange. They hesitated, as if thinking carefully about how to answer. "I live with you," the child said softly, their voice barely audible. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. "What do you mean, you live with me?" I asked, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked at the child again, trying to make sense of what they had just said. Their face was pale, and their features seemed somehow familiar, but not in a way that made sense. I couldn't place it. The child smiled, a soft, almost sad smile that didn't reach their eyes. "I live in your house," they repeated, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. I tried to push the growing sense of dread away, my mind racing. I didn't recognize this child, and yet something about them felt eerily familiar. I had never seen anyone who looked quite like them before. My thoughts swirled with confusion as I looked at the child, their bare feet pressing against the cold pavement. Why were they so insistent on this strange claim? "Where are your parents?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are they waiting for you at home?" The child shook their head slowly. "No," they replied. "I've been waiting for them, but they never came." I didn't know what to say to that. The words seemed to echo in my mind, reverberating in the silence of the street. I took a cautious step closer to the child, scanning the area again, but there was still no one around. No cars passing by, no voices. The street felt empty, too empty. "Come on," I said, trying to sound calm, though I was starting to feel a strange unease building in my chest. "Let's go back to my house, and we'll figure this out." The child nodded and began walking beside me, their small form almost silent as they moved. I kept glancing down at them, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had no idea who this child was or why they seemed to know so much about me, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt that I should take them to my house, even if it was just to figure out what was happening. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice that the child's steps were almost too perfect, too synchronized with mine. They moved in such a way that it felt like they were almost leading me, guiding me down the street without saying a word. The farther we walked, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something in the air felt wrong, as if I was being pulled into something I couldn't control. When we reached my house, I opened the door and let the child inside, my hands shaking slightly as I did. They stepped into the living room without a word, their eyes scanning the room as if they had been there before. I closed the door behind us, my thoughts racing. There was an eerie stillness in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to speak, to ask more questions, but the child's eyes met mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. This wasn't just a child who had wandered off. This was someone who had known me in a way I couldn't explain, someone who seemed to belong in my life but shouldn't have. My mind swirled with confusion, and I felt a growing sense of dread in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The child didn't answer at first. They simply stared at me, their expression unreadable. Then, finally, they smiled again, that same sad smile that sent a chill through me. "I've always been here," they said, their voice soft. "You just didn't remember." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I felt my knees go weak, my vision blurring as I tried to process what was happening. But before I could say anything else, the child turned and disappeared into the hallway, their soft footsteps echoing in the silence. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Something was terribly wrong, and I was too scared to follow them. The house felt different now, colder, like something had shifted. And I knew deep down that I had just invited something into my home that I would never be able to escape. Story 17. I had lived in the apartment building for several months when I first noticed her. She was my neighbor, living in the unit next to mine, and she always seemed to be home. I would often hear soft sounds through the thin walls, footsteps, muffled conversations, the occasional sound of something being moved but never any door opening or closing. I had never seen her leave her apartment, and that struck me as strange, especially since the building had a tight-knit community where everyone would usually cross paths at least once a week. At first, I thought she was just a private person, someone who preferred staying in. Maybe she worked from home, or didn't have many social engagements outside the apartment. Still, there was something unsettling about her. Whenever I passed her door in the hallway, I never saw any sign of life through the crack in her door. The hallway always felt eerily silent, and I couldn't help but wonder what she did all day inside her apartment. I never heard music or television playing, nor did I ever hear her talking to anyone. One afternoon, I returned home to find her standing at her window, staring out. It wasn't unusual for people to look out their windows, but she was standing completely still, her gaze locked on something far below. I couldn't see what she was looking at, but the odd part was how long she stood there. She didn't move a muscle, not even to blink. I found myself standing there for a moment, watching her, feeling a slight unease crawling up my spine. There was something unnatural about the way she stood there, as if she were frozen in time. I decided to be polite and wave, just to acknowledge her presence. Maybe she was simply lost in thought, and a friendly gesture would break the tension. So I raised my hand from the hallway and gave her a casual wave, hoping to get a response. To my surprise, she turned her head and saw me. A small, polite smile spread across her face, and she waved back. I thought nothing of it at first, but then I realized something that made my heart skip a beat. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes remained wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead as if she wasn't really seeing anything at all. For a split second, I felt a chill run through me. The smile was too forced, too mechanical. It wasn't the smile of someone who was genuinely happy to see another person. It felt empty, like an automatic response. She didn't seem to register the gesture, almost as if she was going through the motions of what was expected. I quickly turned and retreated into my apartment, shaking off the weird sensation. But something about that brief interaction lingered in my mind. Over the following days, I began paying more attention to her behavior. I noticed that she never seemed to come out of her apartment, not even for groceries or a walk. I rarely heard her speak to anyone, and when I did catch a faint voice through the walls, it was low, almost whispering. Sometimes I thought I heard soft scratching noises like something being dragged across the floor, but when I listened more closely, it always stopped abruptly, as if she were aware of someone else listening. It felt like I was being drawn into a mystery that I didn't want to be a part of. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when I saw her again at the window, staring out. This time, she wasn't standing still. She was pacing back and forth, her face expressionless. I couldn't see what was going on inside her apartment, but the image of her moving around like that, aimlessly unnerved me. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She looked like a ghost, haunting her own space, trapped in some cycle that I couldn't understand. The next time I saw her, it was even stranger. I was coming home late after work and had just reached my apartment door when I noticed her in the hallway. She was standing a few feet from her door, but there was something odd about the way she was standing. Her body was perfectly still, and her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening for something. Her expression remained unchanged, but there was an eerie air to it. It felt like I had stumbled upon a moment I wasn't supposed to witness. I gave a small nod, unsure of what else to do, and she nodded back, her smile absent, just like the last time. I felt uneasy as I walked past her, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, she was still a friendly neighbor, even if her behavior was strange. The next day, I finally saw her leave her apartment. It was the first time since I had moved in that I saw her actually outside. She was dressed in dark clothes, walking briskly, her eyes fixed on the ground as if she were avoiding anyone's gaze. I tried to greet her, but she didn't respond. It felt like she didn't even notice I was there. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I crossed paths with her in the hallway or saw her through the window, something felt off. It wasn't just the fact that she was always inside, or that her smiles were empty. It was something more, something intangible. Her presence seemed almost unreal, like she was caught in a loop, playing a part in a life that wasn't hers. I started to feel like I was witnessing a person who didn't really exist. One night, after weeks of thinking about it, I made a decision. I would knock on her door, just to check in, to see if everything was okay. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to do it, but it felt like the right thing. I stood outside her door, my hand raised to knock. But before I could, I heard a faint sound coming from inside. It wasn't a voice or a sound of movement, it was a soft, unsettling hum, like a melody playing on repeat. I knocked quickly and stepped back, but there was no answer. After a moment, I left, unsure of what I had just heard. The next morning, I woke up to find that her apartment door was open just a crack. I could see inside, but all I saw was darkness. The air felt thick, as if it had been holding its breath. For the first time, I realized that I had never seen her apartment light on, never seen her come or go. Something in me told me I needed to stop wondering about it, but I couldn't help myself. I was trapped in the mystery of the strange neighbor who smiled but never really saw. Story 18. It was one of those quiet nights where the stillness of the house seemed to amplify every sound, making even the smallest creaks and groans feel louder than they really were. I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background as the only noise. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. when a sudden knock at the door startled me, causing my heart to race. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour, so I hesitated, wondering who could possibly be at my doorstep at this time. I stood still for a moment, my hand resting on the arm of the couch, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I slowly stood up, walking toward the door with cautious steps. My mind raced, trying to think of a reason someone might be knocking at such an hour, but nothing came to mind. I peered through the peephole, seeing a man standing there, dressed in a jacket and jeans. His features were unremarkable, normal height, average build, but there was something about his presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He looked up at the door, meeting my gaze through the peephole, and I froze. His smile was wide, almost too wide, stretching across his face in a way that felt unnatural. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. the kind of smile that made something in my gut twist with discomfort. He spoke then, his voice muffled through the door, but I could make out the words clearly. "Excuse me, I'm lost. Can you help me with directions?" he asked. His tone was calm, almost too calm, and the smile never left his face. My instinct told me not to open the door, not to engage with this man who seemed off in ways I couldn't quite explain. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as I took a step back from the door, feeling safer in the distance. I wasn't sure what it was, but something about the way he smiled, the way he seemed to stare into the peephole, set off every alarm in my mind. I didn't respond, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of knowing I was there. But the knock came again, this time even more forceful, as if he was trying to get my attention. I backed away from the door, my heart thudding in my chest as I tried to think of what to do. I knew it was foolish to open the door at this hour to a stranger, especially someone who already felt so wrong. My eyes kept drifting back to the peephole, and I noticed that he hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his eyes fixed on the door, his smile stretched even wider now, if that was possible. My hand shook as I grabbed my phone from the table, ready to call the police if necessary. I didn't know if I was overreacting, but the situation felt too off to ignore. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as I debated my next move. I felt trapped, stuck in the quiet of my home with this stranger on my doorstep. But then, something strange happened. The man's smile faltered for a moment, almost as if he was aware of my hesitation. He looked to the side, glancing over his shoulder, then quickly turned back to the door. His smile returned, but this time it looked different. It was colder, more calculating, as though he had realized I wasn't going to let him in. He stood still, waiting, as if he was expecting me to open the door. I held my breath, wondering if I should call the police, but I didn't want to make the situation worse by overreacting. I took a step back from the door, unsure of what to do next. The man continued to stand there, motionless, his eyes never leaving the peephole. A few more minutes passed, but the silence was deafening. I could still hear his presence on the other side of the door, and I felt as though I was being watched, analyzed by this stranger who was so intent on getting inside. Finally, I worked up the courage to take another look through the peephole. He was still standing there, but now, there was a shift in his demeanor. His smile was gone, replaced by an unsettling, emotionless expression. It was as though the man had lost all patience, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I didn't know what he was waiting for, but I knew I couldn't stay in the house much longer with him lingering outside. I stepped away from the door and quietly moved toward the phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial the number, I heard a faint sound, almost like a soft shuffle of feet. I rushed back to the peephole, my heart in my throat. The man was gone. In the time it took me to turn away, he had disappeared without a trace. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind trying to process what had just happened. Where had he gone? Had he walked away, or had something else happened? The man's sudden disappearance only deepened the unease that had settled over me. I waited a few moments longer, still hesitant to open the door. But when I did, there was no sign of him, no indication of where he had gone. I stood on the porch, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but the night remained eerily still. There was no sign of the man, no footsteps leading away from my door. I looked to both sides of the street, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and sank against the wall, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this man had been more than just a lost traveler asking for directions. The next morning, I checked my security cameras, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. But when I played back the footage, the man wasn't there at all. There was no knock on the door, no sign of anyone approaching it. It was as though the entire encounter had never happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. And the memory of that man's smile would haunt me for a long time. Story 19. At first, I thought it was a prank. The first note was simple, almost innocuous. I know where you go. I found it wedged under my front door one morning, as if someone had slipped it there while I was asleep. I dismissed it quickly, convinced it was just some twisted joke, but the sense of unease it stirred in me lingered throughout the day. Still, I tried to push it to the back of my mind, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. The second note arrived a few days later. This time it was different, more direct, more unsettling. I see you every night, the message read. I froze when I read it, my stomach twisting with a sense of dread. How could someone know what I did every night? I lived alone, and there was no one around who would have been paying attention to my routine. The note was vague enough that it could have been someone who had simply seen me out at night, but the way it was worded made me feel like it wasn't a coincidence. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had left it had been watching me. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, double-checking everything before I went to bed. I even closed the blinds, trying to make sure no one could see inside. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every sound in the night made me jump. I kept thinking about the note. What if someone had been watching me for weeks? I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of paranoia, convinced that I was being followed, watched, and stalked. The next few days passed without incident, but the sense of dread never fully left. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning my street when I left the house, looking for any sign that someone was following me. I thought I saw someone a few times, but each time I turned around, they were gone, leaving me questioning my own sanity. Was I just imagining things? Or was someone truly out there, lurking in the shadows? Then came the third note. This one was the worst of them all. You'll never escape. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I read the words, the weight of the message sinking deep into my bones. Whoever was sending these notes was no longer just watching, they were threatening me. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape this nightmare that had taken hold of my life. But where could I go? The thought of leaving everything behind, of being forced out of my own home, was terrifying. I spent that evening pacing my apartment, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the note, the way it made me feel trapped, as though there was no place safe anymore. Whoever this was, they weren't going to stop until they had me. I was certain of it, and I didn't know how to fight back. The next morning, I woke up to find another note under my door. This one was different from the others. It wasn't just a few words. The paper was covered in strange scribbles and half-finished sentences, as though the person writing it was losing control. You can't hide. I'm everywhere. I've been here longer than you know. My hands trembled as I read the note, the ink smearing slightly where my fingers had touched it. This wasn't just some random person with a grudge anymore. It was something more. Someone who had been watching me for far longer than I had realized. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. I went to the police, but they couldn't do much without more evidence. All I had were these cryptic notes and a growing sense of fear that refused to go away. The officer I spoke to gave me a list of precautions: lock all the windows, keep a light on at night, be aware of my surroundings, but nothing felt like enough. The notes were getting more personal, more threatening, and I was starting to feel like I was in too deep. That night, I stayed awake, watching the shadows outside my windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was doing this. Every car that passed by seemed to slow down as it neared my house, and my heart would race in anticipation, only to have the car speed away without stopping. It was as though my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched, the constant presence of someone out there, waiting. A week later, the note stopped. For a few days I thought maybe it was over, that whoever had been tormenting me had moved on. I tried to breathe again, tried to live without the constant fear that had consumed me for so long. But just when I thought I could let my guard down, I found a final note on my doorstep, slipped under the door, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to strike. It was the shortest note yet. "You're mine now." I stared at it, the words burning into my mind. My entire body went cold. I felt like the walls were closing in around me, like I was suffocating in a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. But where could I go? Who could I turn to? The finality of the note left me paralyzed with fear. It wasn't just a game anymore. Whoever was behind this was relentless, and I had no idea how far they would go. I spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on anything except the thought that I was being hunted. My life, my home, my safety, all of it had been stripped away by these notes. I couldn't live like this any longer. I packed what little I could and left, moving in with a friend while I tried to make sense of what had happened. But even now, as I sit here, I can't shake the feeling that whoever wrote those notes is still out there, waiting. I don't know if they're following me, if they found me again, but the haunting words still echo in my mind, "You're mine now, and no matter where I go, I'll never feel safe again." Story 20. It was the middle of the night when I woke up, a feeling of unease prickling my skin. The room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight that filtered through the curtains. I was staying at my friend's house for the weekend, far away from the familiarity of my own place. The house was old, the kind that creaked and groaned in the night, but it was cozy, and I'd always felt comfortable there until now. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but it lingered, an unexplainable discomfort. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I could hear the faint sound of wind rustling the trees outside. The night felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating. It was then that I noticed a shadow moving outside the window, the faintest shift in the darkness that made my heart race. At first, I thought it was just the trees swaying in the wind, casting their shadows across the yard. But then the figure became clearer, and my breath caught in my throat. There, standing just beyond the window, was a man. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could make out his silhouette, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? Had my eyes adjusted to the darkness in a way that made the figure seem more menacing? But no, as I blinked and focused, the man remained, his presence undeniable. His stillness was unnerving, as if he were waiting for something, or someone, and that someone I realized was me. I wanted to scream, to call out, but the words caught in my throat. The man didn't react, didn't flinch at the sound of my breathing growing shallow. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me through the glass. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to move, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in the trance of his stare. I glanced around the room, searching for something to protect myself, but there was nothing. The window was too far from the door, and I didn't want to take my eyes off the figure for even a second. My mind spun with questions. Was he someone who had mistaken the house for another? Or was he someone who had been watching for a while, waiting for the perfect moment to make himself known? And then, in a split second, the man did something that made my blood run cold. His head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging that I had noticed him. It wasn't a casual tilt, but something deliberate, almost like he was studying my every reaction. My breath caught in my throat, and panic surged through me. I finally found my voice, letting out a sharp, terrified scream. The sound echoed through the room, but as soon as the scream left my lips, the man vanished. He didn't move away or step back into the shadows, he simply disappeared, as if the air around him had swallowed him whole. The spot where he had been standing was empty, the yard just as dark and still as it had been moments before. I scrambled to my feet, rushing to the window, but there was no sign of him. Nothing. I pressed my face against the glass, my hands shaking as I searched the yard, but it was as if he had never been there at all. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the moonlight bathed the garden in an eerie glow. No trace of the man remained. My mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had it all been a dream? I turned quickly, rushing out of the room and down the hall to my friend's bedroom. I knocked frantically on the door, my voice trembling as I called her name. When she groggily opened the door, I could see the confusion in her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, still half asleep. I tried to explain, but the words came out in a rush, tangled and frantic. "There was a man outside my window," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was standing there, staring at me. And when I screamed, he just disappeared." My friend looked at me, her expression slowly shifting from confusion to concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, stepping aside to let me in. "There's nothing out there, I promise. You must have been dreaming or seeing things." I shook my head, my heart still racing in my chest. No, it wasn't a dream. I saw him. He was real. But as I said the words, I couldn't help but feel a seed of doubt sprout in my mind. What if it had been some trick of the light, or a reflection I hadn't noticed before? I didn't want to sound crazy, but the terror I felt was real. The memory of his gaze, cold and unblinking, still haunted me. We decided to check the yard, just to be sure. My friend grabbed a flashlight, and we made our way downstairs and out the back door. The air was cold, and the night felt strangely silent, as if the world around us had gone still. We walked around the perimeter of the house, shining the beam of light into every corner, every shadow. But there was no sign of anyone, no footprints or disturbances in the grass. It was as if the man had never been there. When we returned to the house, my friend tried to reassure me. "It's probably nothing," she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. "Maybe you just imagined it. You're stressed, maybe a little tired." But I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the same flicker of doubt that had settled in my own mind. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the image of the man standing there, his face obscured by the darkness, waiting for something, waiting for me. And though I never saw him again, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching. Story 21. It all started one evening when I received a text from an unknown number. The message was brief, just a location pin dropped on a map. No words, no explanation, just coordinates. I stared at my phone, confused, wondering who could have sent it and why. I had no idea where the location was, but the longer I stared, the more familiar it seemed. I opened up the map, zooming in, and realized the pin was for a small coffee shop I'd visited earlier that week. I dismissed it as a coincidence or maybe a mistake. Maybe someone had meant to send it to someone else. I didn't think much of it, assuming it would be a one-time thing. But the next day, the texts started coming in regularly. Every few hours, a new location pin would appear, leading me to places I had recently visited. The second pin led me to the grocery store where I had bought some items the day before. Then came one for the park, where I'd gone for a walk last weekend. Each location felt a little too precise, a little too much like someone was paying attention to my every move. By the time the fourth pin arrived, I was starting to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't know who this person was or why they were doing this, but it felt personal. There was no message, no context, just the pin, each one leading to a place I'd been, places I had no reason to believe anyone would know about, unless they were keeping track of me. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a stalker, maybe someone from my past had resurfaced, but there was no way to know for sure. I began to change my routines, hoping it would throw whoever it was off track. I took a different route to work, avoided places I frequented, and tried to keep to myself. But the pins kept coming. Each location felt more specific, more intrusive. The pins showed up at restaurants I had eaten at, streets I had walked down, even the library I had visited just days ago. Whoever this was seemed to know exactly where I'd been, and it was starting to feel like they were tracking my every step. The silence of the text was unsettling. There were no words accompanying the locations, just the pins dropped on a map, as if whoever was behind them was waiting for me to follow them. I never did, not at first. But the feeling of being followed was growing harder to ignore. It felt like a game, one where I was the prey, and the sender of the texts was the hunter. I couldn't decide if I should go to the police or try to confront the person myself. Neither option seemed safe. One night after I had just gotten home from work, the next text arrived. This one was different. Instead of a location pin, it was simply a message, "You're getting closer." I froze as I read it, my stomach sinking. I hadn't been out since I got home, and the message made it clear that someone knew where I was. The realization hit me with full force. This wasn't just random locations anymore. This was deliberate, calculated. The sender knew exactly where I was, and they were playing with me. I stood there, staring at the screen, the anxiety coursing through me. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I looked out my window, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching. The message was clear: this person was close, and I was being drawn into whatever game they were playing. I couldn't let my guard down, not for a second. The next morning, the next location pin appeared. It was just outside my workplace. My stomach churned. How had they known I would be there? I hadn't shared my schedule with anyone, and I was careful about my privacy. I immediately texted my best friend, telling her about the situation and asking if she could come over. I needed someone to be with me, to take my mind off the mounting fear that had begun to settle in my chest. She agreed to come over, but before she arrived, another text came through. This time it was just a location pin again, but the spot was different. It was at a small cafe I'd visited once with my friend a few weeks ago. The moment I saw it, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't just some random coincidence anymore, it was deliberate and methodical. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever was sending these knew every detail of my life. It felt suffocating. I waited in my apartment, the feeling of unease gnawing at me. My mind kept racing through different possibilities, none of them offering any comfort. Was someone watching me from the shadows? Had I been followed home? I couldn't stop thinking about how close they were getting. It wasn't just the texts, it was the feeling that they were always right there, just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. Just as I was about to text my friend again, a new message came through. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the location pin. This time it was different. It wasn't a place I had been recently. It wasn't even a place I'd ever been before. The pin dropped directly outside my front door. I froze. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been sending these messages was here, at my doorstep. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt their presence. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to lock the doors, to hide, to get out. But I couldn't move. My phone buzzed again. The text was simple, "I see you." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, but I couldn't leave either. I had no idea if this person was out there, watching, or if they were waiting for me to make the first move. My mind was reeling, and the fear felt like a thick fog surrounding me, closing in with every passing second. I finally found the courage to call the police. They told me they would send someone to check things out, but I didn't know if they would be able to help. The feeling that I was being watched never left, and I knew that whoever had been sending the texts was still out there, just beyond my reach. The messages had stopped, but the fear remained heavy in the air. Story 22. The evening air was cool as I walked to my car after another long day at work. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars scattered here and there, and the fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an eerie glow over the scene. My mind was still on the workday, thoughts of the projects I had left unfinished and the tasks waiting for me tomorrow. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings until I noticed a figure standing next to my car. At first, I thought nothing of it. People sometimes linger in parking lots, perhaps waiting for someone or just killing time. But as I drew closer, I realized something was off. The man didn't look up as I approached, his attention focused entirely on what he was doing. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was trying to hide something or perhaps fix something that had broken. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had started to settle in the pit of my stomach. It was only when I was a few feet away that I noticed what he was holding in his hands. My heart skipped a beat. It was a pair of my keys, the ones I always carried with me for work and home. The familiar keychain jangled softly as he fiddled with it, his fingers moving over the metal. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How did he have my keys? I hadn't seen him before, and I certainly hadn't given anyone permission to touch my things, let alone have my keys. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to make sense of the situation. The man still hadn't looked up, as if completely unaware of my presence, or perhaps he was pretending not to notice. A dozen questions raced through my mind. How did he get my keys? Had I lost them at some point? Was he trying to break into my car? I wasn't sure what to do, whether to call for help or confront him directly, but I knew I had to act quickly. I cleared my throat, trying to make my voice sound confident. "Hey," I called out, taking a step closer. "What are you doing with my keys?" My voice came out a little shakier than I had intended, but I couldn't help it. The situation was bizarre, and a sense of dread was creeping up my spine. The man didn't flinch, didn't even glance at me. He just continued to fiddle with the keys, his expression unreadable. I took another step forward, now standing just a few feet away from him. "Those are mine," I repeated, my tone firmer this time. "Where did you get them?" Still, no response. It was as though I wasn't even there. The only sound was the faint clinking of the keys in his hands. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I began to back away slowly, my eyes never leaving the man. He was still standing there, not acknowledging me, as though he was in a trance or deliberately ignoring me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe he had stolen my keys at some point earlier in the day without me noticing. Or maybe he was just some random person with an unsettling interest in my things. I kept backing away, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off the man, feeling a growing sense of panic. What if he had been watching me for a while? What if he had some kind of plan, something more sinister than just fiddling with my keys? I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed to get away, to find safety. Just as I turned to make a run for it, I heard the man's voice for the first time. It was low and gravelly, almost like a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his words sending a chill down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I froze in place. What did he mean by that? I had never seen him before, let alone interacted with him. How did he know where I was going to be? I didn't wait for another word. My legs moved before I could fully process what was happening, my feet carrying me toward the exit of the parking lot at a frantic pace. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me. The thought of him watching me, knowing something I didn't, made my pulse race. I reached my car in record time, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors behind me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The man was still out there somewhere, though I couldn't see him now. I had no idea if he had followed me or if he was still standing by my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was close. I glanced in the rearview mirror before pulling out of the parking lot, half expecting to see him standing there, staring at me. But there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot, the same as it had been before. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the strange encounter over and over again. The man's words kept echoing in my head. "You shouldn't have come back." What did he mean by that? Had he been watching me before tonight? And how did he get my keys? The questions were endless, and the answers seemed just out of reach. The next day, I called the security office at my workplace to report the incident. The guard on duty told me that no one had seen anything unusual, and there were no signs of a break-in or any unusual activity. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or more unsettled. How had the man gotten my keys without anyone noticing? And why had he been there in the first place? I checked my car that evening, making sure nothing had been tampered with. Everything seemed fine, but the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I had narrowly escaped something worse. And even though I had no answers, the question still haunted me. Who was that man, and what did he want with my keys? Story 23. It was just after 2 a.m. when my phone rang, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. I was barely awake, groggy from a long day, and instinctively reached for the phone. I expected it to be some telemarketer or wrong number, so I answered it without much thought. However, as soon as I said hello, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I waited a few seconds, but the silence continued, the only sound the faint crackle of the line. I waited, but no one responded. The line stayed dead, and I could feel the weight of the quiet pressing in on me. After a moment, I hung up, assuming it had been a mistake or a pocket dial. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, telling myself that it was nothing to worry about. But then, before I had time to even think, my phone rang again. The same unknown number appeared on the screen. This time I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding as I stared at the phone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I answered the call again, hoping for some kind of explanation. But when I did, I immediately heard the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. The air was thick and ragged, as if the person on the other end was struggling to control their breath. I held the phone tighter, my grip starting to feel uncomfortably tight as I listened. The breathing continued, louder now, closer, as if the person was right next to me. I tried to speak, to ask who it was, but no words came. My throat felt tight with a growing sense of dread. The breathing became more intense, and for a brief moment I thought I could hear faint whispers through the heavy exhale. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt like they were meant for me. My pulse quickened, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Before I could react, the call was abruptly cut off. The line went dead once again, and I was left holding the phone to my ear, confused and unsettled. I stared at the screen, hoping it would display something more than the empty call log, but there was nothing. No message, no clue as to who had just called, or why they'd left. Nothing but an unsettling silence followed by ragged breathing. I set the phone down, trying to convince myself that it was some sick joke, or maybe a prank from a friend. But the unease remained, crawling under my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was out there, somewhere. It didn't make sense. Why would someone call at 2 a.m. and leave nothing but breathing? And why call back so quickly? My mind raced with thoughts and questions, none of which had any answers. I thought about calling the police, but it seemed absurd. No crime had been committed. It was just a strange, silent phone call, something that could be easily explained away. But the breathing, the sense of urgency, it all felt too real, too close. After a few minutes of indecision, I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping that whatever had happened would fade with the morning light. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of heavy breathing echoing in my mind. It was as though the caller's presence lingered in the room with me. I kept checking my phone, convinced that there would be another call, but the screen remained silent. It wasn't until dawn that I finally managed to fall into a restless sleep, my mind exhausted from the fear and anxiety. The following morning, I awoke to a strange sense of unease that hadn't left me. The phone call, though it happened hours ago, still felt fresh in my mind. I glanced at my phone again, half expecting another unknown number to appear, but there was nothing. The silence felt louder now, as if the world had gone quiet in the wake of the strange experience. I tried to go about my day as normal, but the thought of the call kept creeping into my mind. I couldn't help but wonder who would make such a call, and why they would do it at such an odd hour. What was the point of it, and why had they hung up so suddenly? It didn't feel like a prank. It felt intentional, like a message, but I had no idea what the message was. The oddest part of all of this was that I never received another call from that number. For days, nothing came through. No heavy breathing, no strange whispers, just silence. But it didn't feel like it was over. I couldn't let go of the lingering sense that something had happened, something I hadn't understood. It felt like I was waiting for something to happen, for the next chapter in this strange, unsettling story. Then a week later, the phone rang again. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a sudden surge of panic. The same unknown number appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, my hand hovering over the phone. This time I didn't answer. I let it ring, the seconds stretching on like an eternity. After the third ring, the call stopped. I exhaled, but the sense of dread didn't go away. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. It was as though the call had been a warning, a reminder that whatever had happened before wasn't just a coincidence. I still couldn't understand it, but now I knew that whatever it wasn't finished. It was watching, waiting, and the silence between the calls felt like the calm before the storm. Story 24. After a long day at work, I made my usual stop at the local coffee shop on the way home. The warmth of the place and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee always helped me unwind. I ordered my regular, found a cozy corner, and spent some time reading through emails. I had no idea that a simple mistake would lead to something that still haunts me. When I finished my coffee and prepared to leave, I realized something was missing. My backpack. I glanced around, hoping I had just forgotten where I'd set it down, but it wasn't anywhere in sight. I quickly checked the table, the chairs, and even the restroom, but it was nowhere to be found. I went up to the counter to ask the barista, who had been there the entire time. The barista looked at me with a confused expression. "We haven't seen any backpacks," she said, scanning the area behind the counter in the front of the shop. "Are you sure you brought it in here?" I nodded, starting to feel a sense of unease wash over me. The backpack was a black, worn leather bag I carried everywhere, and I couldn't have left it behind. I must have looked worried because the barista suggested I leave my number in case it turned up. I agreed, but as I left the shop, the nagging thought that something wasn't quite right began to grow. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired and stressed from the day's work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. That evening, I tried to distract myself. I made dinner, scrolled through social media, and watched a movie, but every time I looked around the apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about my backpack. I had stored everything in it: my phone charger, keys, wallet, and the notebook I'd been writing in for months. It wasn't like me to forget something so important. The next morning, I returned to the coffee shop to see if my bag had been found. I walked in, a little hesitant, unsure if I was overreacting. The barista from the night before wasn't there, but the new one greeted me with a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I explained the situation again, and she assured me they would check the lost and found. She looked through the back room and came out empty-handed. "Sorry, we don't have any bags that match your description. Have you checked with the local lost and found?" I shook my head, frustration growing. This was more than just a lost bag. I was starting to feel like something strange was going on. I left the coffee shop feeling defeated, convinced I would never see my backpack again. But as I passed by a park on my way home, something caught my eye: a familiar black leather strap sticking out from behind a bench. My heart skipped a beat as I walked over to investigate. There, in the corner, was my backpack, slightly scuffed but still recognizable. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I reached for it, a cold chill ran down my spine. I opened the flap and peered inside, relieved to see everything seemed to be in its place. But then I noticed something odd. At the very bottom of the bag, underneath my notebook, was a folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was scrawled in uneven letters, almost as if it had been written quickly. The note read, "I know what you're hiding." I froze. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the message. Who could have left it there? Who knew what I was hiding? My heart pounded in my chest as I searched my memory for anything that could explain this strange occurrence. But nothing made sense. I had nothing to hide, at least nothing that would warrant such a message. I stood there in the park, holding the note in my hand, trying to calm my nerves. I looked around, but there was no one nearby, just a few joggers passing by. I felt exposed, as if someone was watching me, though I couldn't see anyone who seemed suspicious. I quickly shoved the note back into my bag and left the park, feeling a strange urgency to get home and figure out what was happening. Back in my apartment, I examined the note again, looking for any clues. It was written on plain, unmarked paper, and there were no fingerprints or identifying marks. Whoever had left it had taken care to cover their tracks. My thoughts drifted to the past few months, anything I could have done to provoke someone. But nothing came to mind. I had been going about my life as usual, never imagining that someone would target me in this way. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Could it be a prank? A mistake? Or was someone actually watching me, tracking my every move? I felt like I was being pulled into something I didn't understand, and the weight of the note pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling paranoid, but nothing unusual happened. No one seemed to follow me, and nothing was out of place. But then, one evening I came home to find a second note, this time taped to my front door. The note was different, written in the same jagged script, but the words were far more chilling. "You're not as careful as you think." I didn't know what to do. Whoever was behind this had escalated things, and I felt more vulnerable than ever. I wasn't sure if I was dealing with an obsessed stalker, or if there was something deeper, something I was missing. The sense of dread that had followed me ever since I lost my backpack only grew stronger. I had to find out who was behind it, and why. And I knew that this wouldn't be the last note. Story 25. It was a cold evening when I found myself waiting at the bus stop. The streets were empty, and the usual hum of the city felt distant, muffled by the chill in the air. I was exhausted from a long day at work, eager to get home and rest. The bus was running late, as usual, and I pulled my coat tighter around me to fend off the creeping cold. I glanced around, the street lamp flickering above me, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. That's when I noticed him, a man who had appeared from seemingly nowhere. He walked up to the bench and sat down beside me without a word. I hadn't heard him approach, but now he was there, too close for comfort. He didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't even look in my direction. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his posture stiff and unrelaxed, as if he was trying to blend into the darkness. I shifted uncomfortably, feeling a strange sense of unease wash over me. The air between us felt thick, charged with something unspoken. I tried to distract myself, pulling out my phone to check the time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The man sat motionless, his legs angled away from mine, as though trying to give me space. But the proximity of his presence was unsettling in a way that made me want to move, to put distance between us. The sound of the approaching bus broke the silence, and I felt a small sense of relief. The familiar rumble of the engine meant the end of this uncomfortable encounter. I stood up, adjusting my bag as I prepared to board. But to my surprise, the man didn't move. He didn't stand up to join the rest of us waiting for the bus. Instead, he just stayed seated, staring down at the ground with an almost unnatural stillness. As the bus pulled up and the doors opened, I glanced back at him. He didn't seem to notice or care. His gaze remained fixed, unmoving, as if he had no intention of getting on. The driver called out for passengers to board, and I stepped forward, still unsettled by the man's strange behavior. I hesitated for a moment, my foot hovering just above the steps of the bus, but something made me glance back once more. The man was still sitting there, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes unblinking. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge anyone else. For a brief moment our eyes met, and I felt a chill run through me, like a cold wind had swept across the bench. His face was blank, expressionless, as if he had no interest in the world around him. It was as though he existed in a different reality, one that didn't include the bus, the people, or even me. I quickly boarded the bus, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that lingered. I chose a seat near the front, but I couldn't help but glance out the window as the bus started to pull away. The man was still sitting at the bench, motionless. He hadn't moved an inch. The bus rolled forward and I looked away, focusing on the road ahead. But a part of me couldn't stop thinking about him, about the strange silence that had hung between us. As the bus continued down the street, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe he was just a person waiting for a different bus, or perhaps he was lost in thought. But something about the way he sat there, so rigid, so detached, didn't sit right with me. He hadn't even looked at anyone else, not a single glance at the other people waiting at the bus stop. It was as if he was waiting for something, but for what, I couldn't say. I kept my gaze fixed out the window, but the image of the man wouldn't leave my mind. I replayed the moment in my head, the way he had sat down beside me without a word, the way he had stared at the ground, completely unaware or uninterested in the world around him. It was almost as if he didn't belong in that moment, like he had no real reason to be there. The bus began to slow as it approached the next stop, and I glanced up. The streets were quiet now, the usual noise of the city muffled by the evening hour. As the doors opened and people began to board, I briefly caught sight of a few others waiting at the stop. But there was no sign of the man. He had vanished. I stared out the window, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined the whole thing? It was entirely possible, I thought. Maybe I had been too tired, too distracted by the lateness of the hour to notice the details. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. There was something about that moment that didn't add up, something I couldn't explain. The rest of the ride was uneventful, and before I knew it, I had reached my stop. I got off the bus and made my way to my apartment, but the strange encounter stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of the man sitting there at the bus stop, staring at the ground as if waiting for something or someone. It felt like an encounter I shouldn't have had, like I had crossed paths with someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Or for the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. I wondered if I'd see him again, if our paths would cross once more at that same bus stop. But each time I boarded the bus, he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had never existed, as if that strange moment had been a figment of my imagination. Still, a part of me couldn't forget the eerie stillness he had exuded, the way he had seemed so out of place in the world around him. And so, I tried to move on, to forget about it. But every now and then, when I was waiting for the bus, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, sitting next to me, staring at the ground in silence. But each time I was met with only the empty bench and the cold night air. Story 26. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the delivery driver pulled up to my house. I had just returned from running errands and was looking forward to relaxing for the rest of the day. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. I noticed the delivery truck outside and figured it was for one of the neighbors, as I wasn't expecting any packages. The driver stepped out of the truck, holding a large box in his arms. He walked up the driveway, looking down at the label on the package as he approached my front door. I didn't think much of it at first, but when he rang the doorbell, I figured I'd better answer, as it was likely meant for someone else. I opened the door, and the driver gave me a polite but distant smile. "Hello, I've got a package for you," he said, holding the box out towards me. I glanced down at the label and immediately noticed the address wasn't mine. It was meant for a neighbor a few houses down the street. I pointed this out to the driver, offering a polite smile of my own. "This package is for the house next door," I said. "You've got the wrong address." The driver didn't immediately respond. He stood there for a moment, looking at the package, then back at me. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the usual friendly demeanor to something more distant. It was as if I had said something that caused him to pause, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. After what felt like an uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke. "Are you sure this is where you live?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes seemed to linger on mine a little longer than necessary, and I felt an odd unease settle in my stomach. I nodded quickly, trying to brush off the strange feeling creeping up on me. "Yes, this is my house," I said, trying to reassure both myself and him. "I've lived here for years." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the package again, then back up at me. His eyes narrowed slightly, and I noticed the way he was studying me. It was subtle, but it was enough to make me feel uncomfortable. "I see," he said finally, his tone still calm but now laced with something I couldn't quite place. He held the box out to me again, and I instinctively took a step back. "Well, I'll leave it here for you, then," he added. I didn't know why, but I hesitated. It felt wrong to accept a package that clearly wasn't mine, and the driver's odd behavior was making me second-guess everything. I glanced back at the house next door, wondering if I should just tell him to deliver it to the correct address instead. Before I could say anything, the driver took a step back, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'll let you handle it," he said, his voice suddenly colder. He turned and walked back to his truck without another word. I stood there for a moment, still holding the door open, watching as he climbed into the truck and drove away. The whole exchange had been strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Why had he asked if I was sure this was where I lived? And why had he seemed so distant? Shaking my head, I decided to focus on the package. It wasn't mine, but I couldn't just leave it sitting on my doorstep. I took it inside and set it down on the kitchen counter, still unsure of what to do with it. I should have just called the neighbor and told them to pick it up, but the odd interaction with the delivery driver was lingering in my mind, making everything feel a little more unsettling. I grabbed my phone and dialed the neighbor's number. As it rang, I glanced back at the package, my curiosity getting the better of me. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it in a way that felt out of place. When the call went to voicemail, I left a quick message telling them about the delivery mix-up and that I'd leave the package on their porch. But when I turned to walk away, something made me stop. The box wasn't sealed in the usual way. The tape looked like it had been hastily applied, and the edges were slightly uneven. I leaned in closer, my mind racing with questions. What if the package wasn't for the neighbor after all? What if it was meant for me, but something was off about it? I carefully peeled back the tape, my hands trembling slightly. Inside, there was a smaller box wrapped in plain brown paper. My heart skipped a beat as I carefully unwrapped it, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that was beginning to grow in the pit of my stomach. I pulled the paper off, revealing a small, unmarked box, no labels, no return address. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. What in the world was going on? I was about to open the small box when I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt in my chest, and I quickly shoved the package into a drawer, hoping it would go unnoticed. I walked to the door, feeling uneasy once again. This time I didn't open it right away. I peered through the peephole, and to my surprise, it was the same delivery driver. I didn't want to face him again. His questions had unsettled me enough the first time. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for him to leave, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the door. After what felt like an eternity, I backed away from the door and turned off the lights. The delivery driver never left, and as I stood in the dark, I realized with growing horror that I was no longer certain if I even knew where I lived anymore. Story 27. I had been visiting my friend Sarah in the hospital for a few days. She had been in and out of surgeries, and I knew it would take a while for her to fully recover. The sterile smell of the hospital, the faint beeping of monitors, and the low hum of fluorescent lights had started to become familiar to me, though still uncomfortable. I tried to keep her spirits up by staying positive, but as the days passed, I began to feel a strange unease whenever I walked the halls. On this particular visit, Sarah had just fallen asleep, so I decided to step out of her room for a quick break. The hospital floor was quiet, with only the soft murmur of distant conversations and the occasional shuffle of nurses' footsteps. As I made my way down the long white corridor, I noticed something odd. At the end of the hallway, sitting alone in a chair, was a man. He was dressed in a simple black jacket, his legs crossed casually as if he were waiting for someone, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. He wasn't looking at anyone else, his eyes were fixed on me. He was staring directly at me, and it was the kind of stare that felt unnerving, like he was studying me, examining every movement, every detail of my appearance. I tried to dismiss the feeling, convincing myself that maybe he was just waiting for a family member or a visitor. But the longer I looked at him, the more discomfort I felt. His expression was unreadable, and his gaze didn't waver, even when I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. I started walking again, hoping the moment would pass, but as I got closer to him, I realized he wasn't moving. He was still sitting in the same spot, not adjusting his position or acknowledging anyone else who walked past. It was as if time had stopped for him, and he was locked in place, waiting for something. My heart began to race slightly as I neared him. The closer I got, the more intense his stare became. It felt like he was following me with his eyes, his gaze never blinking. It was unsettling, and I found myself hurrying past him, feeling a sense of relief as I walked by. But when I reached the end of the hallway and turned a corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I had been so focused on his stare that I hadn't noticed much else about him, his clothes, his demeanor, or even his surroundings. Now that I was further away, I felt as if the weight of his gaze was still pressing down on me, and it made me feel like I was being hunted, like I was somehow under surveillance. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself that I was overreacting. Hospitals were full of strange, unexplainable moments, right? As I walked back toward Sarah's room, I saw him again, but this time he was further down the hallway, in the same position. I stopped in my tracks. Hadn't he been sitting near the end of the hall earlier? How had he moved so quickly? It was impossible, and yet there he was, staring at me once again. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the thought that he was following me somehow, or perhaps that he was just waiting for me to make the next move. The atmosphere in the hospital seemed to thicken, and everything around me felt wrong. I tried to look away and walk faster, but I found my gaze drawn back to him, unable to resist the pull of his unsettling stare. He didn't move, his body was completely still, except for his eyes, which tracked my every step. I quickly stepped into Sarah's room, closing the door behind me. The silence of the room felt heavy, and for a moment I just stood there, leaning against the door, trying to gather myself. The sense of being watched lingered in my chest, making my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as I sat down beside Sarah's bed, I couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting the man to appear in the hallway. Every time I heard footsteps or a door opening, my heart skipped a beat. But no one came. No one entered the hallway, and the minutes stretched into hours as I sat there, keeping watch over Sarah. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, his piercing, unblinking gaze following me through the darkness. By the time Sarah woke up a few hours later, I was exhausted and on edge. I didn't want to bring up the strange encounter, afraid she might think I was imagining things, but the sense of unease stayed with me. I made my way back to the waiting area to grab a quick cup of coffee, hoping to clear my mind. As I walked through the hospital, I tried to shake the feeling of paranoia, but when I reached the same hallway, I stopped in my tracks. There was no sign of the man. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself it had all been in my head. But then, as I walked back toward the elevator, I caught a glimpse of someone in my peripheral vision. It was him, standing by the emergency exit, his eyes locked on mine from across the room. His stare was just as intense as before, as if he'd been waiting for me the entire time. I quickly looked away, my pulse quickening. I couldn't explain why, but I felt certain that this man had been watching me from the moment I entered the hospital. I took the elevator and left the hospital as soon as I could. The strange man never spoke a word, never made a single move other than watching me with those eerie, unblinking eyes. Even as I walked out of the hospital, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still watching, still following my every step. I never saw him again, but the memory of his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, stayed with me long after I left. Story 28. It was one of those nights where the store felt eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to hang in the air and make every sound more pronounced. I had been there for a while, wandering through the aisles, picking up the usual items: bread, milk, some snacks. The store was practically empty, save for a few other late-night shoppers. The only light was the soft glow of the fluorescent bulbs above, casting a faint buzz in the otherwise calm atmosphere. As I made my way down the pasta aisle, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cold of the air-conditioned store, but something else, something that made me pause for a moment. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the quiet of the late hour. I continued picking out the items on my list, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. I turned the corner into the canned goods aisle, trying to focus on the task at hand. But as I reached for a can of beans, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved behind me, shifting in the dim light. I froze. It wasn't a reflection or a trick of the light. It was too defined, too deliberate. The shadow seemed to shift with me, keeping pace as I moved down the aisle. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that it wasn't just a random movement. It was following me. I walked faster, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping over me. But no matter how quickly I moved, the shadow remained, just out of the corner of my vision, always there. I felt my heart start to race. It was a strange sensation, like being pursued without anyone actually being there. I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but when I looked, there was no one, just the empty aisle and the faint flicker of the overhead lights. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the store. I still had a few items to pick up, and it seemed silly to let something so trivial throw me off. So I turned back around and continued down the aisle, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The shadow behind me seemed to move closer, edging into my peripheral vision. I couldn't bring myself to look again, too afraid of what I might see. I stopped in front of the cereal section, pretending to browse through the boxes while my mind raced. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run out of the store and never look back. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted in place. I glanced down the aisle, half expecting to see someone approaching, but the only movement was the soft sway of the overhead lights. I looked up and caught another glimpse of the shadow, this time darker and more defined. It was moving closer, inch by inch, as though it was drawing nearer to me, and the sense of dread that I had been pushing aside began to overwhelm me. I turned quickly, facing the direction of the shadow, and there at the end of the aisle I saw it. A figure tall, slender, its shape distorted by the dim light. It was standing perfectly still, as though waiting for me to notice it. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching me with an eerie stillness. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain what was happening. The shadow seemed to twist, elongating as though it were coming out of the floor itself. I stepped backward, my feet stumbling as I tried to retreat, but when I glanced back, the figure had disappeared. It was gone, as though it had never been there at all. The aisle was empty, just rows of canned goods and a flickering light above. My mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps I was just imagining things. I turned around again, hoping that I was overreacting, but the feeling of unease still lingered in my chest. I walked quickly down the aisle, moving past the cereal section and out into the next area of the store, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but the aisle remained empty, as it had been before. Despite my attempts to convince myself that nothing had happened, the sense of dread only deepened as I moved toward the dairy section. It was as though the store had grown colder, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The quiet hum of the refrigerators was the only sound, and it felt as if the store had become a labyrinth, its aisles twisting and turning in ways that didn't quite make sense. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the shadow once again, but there was nothing. I reached for a carton of milk, my hand shaking as I grasped it. The fluorescent lights above flickered once more, and the entire store seemed to breathe with a heavy, unnatural weight. My pulse quickened as I glanced down the aisle, and there it was again. The shadow, this time not in the corner of my eye but directly ahead of me, moving with deliberate, steady steps. I froze, staring at the figure, waiting for it to make its move. But then, just as before, it disappeared. There was no one there, nothing but the empty aisles stretching out in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly made my way to the checkout, keeping my eyes fixed on the path in front of me, praying that whatever was following me would stay away. When I finally made it to the register, I didn't dare look behind me. I just wanted to leave, to escape the store and the strange presence that had haunted its aisles. As I walked out the door, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the shadow still lingering inside, waiting for me. But the store was quiet, empty, just as it had been when I arrived. As I drove home, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it the stress, the loneliness of being in the store so late? Or was something else in that store, something I couldn't explain, truly watching me? The shadow in the store lingered in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still following me. Story 29. It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything seems peaceful, almost too peaceful. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, watching TV, when I heard a faint tapping at the window. I thought it was just a bird pecking at the glass, maybe trying to get out of the rain, so I didn't pay it much attention at first. But the tapping continued, growing more rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking on the window. Curious, I glanced over at the window, half expecting to see nothing more than a bird, or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze. But what I saw instead sent a chill through my entire body. A man stood outside, his face partially obscured by the night, but his posture was unmistakable. He was holding his phone up, pointing it directly at me as if he were taking pictures of me sitting there. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. I rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, he was still there, standing motionless. My heart began to race as I stood frozen, not sure what to do. The window was only a few feet away from where I sat, and the man seemed completely aware that I had noticed him. I quickly glanced around the room, checking the locks on the doors, but my mind was still fixated on the man outside. Why was he standing there, taking pictures of me? I couldn't understand it. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't want to overreact, thinking maybe he was just some passerby who got a little too close. But then I saw the way he moved. Slowly, he lowered the phone and took a step closer to the window, his eyes never leaving me. It was as if he was studying me, waiting for me to make a move. I felt a sense of dread washing over me, and my skin prickled with the feeling of being hunted. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I waited for the operator to pick up. The moment I took my eyes off the window, everything seemed to happen at once. I heard a soft rustling sound, and when I turned back to look, the man was gone. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Had I imagined it? Maybe I was just so shaken that my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, I knew what I had seen. He was there, right outside the window, and now he was gone. The 911 operator finally answered, and I quickly told them about the man outside my window. I was already pacing the room, my eyes darting around, afraid to take my gaze off the window for too long. The operator assured me that a patrol car would be on its way soon, but I felt a sense of urgency deep in my gut. What if he came back? What if he was still out there, waiting for the right moment to do something worse? The sound of sirens in the distance was a small comfort, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I stood by the window, my heart pounding in my chest, staring into the darkness outside, hoping I wouldn't see that man's face again. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each passing second making me feel more vulnerable. My phone was still clutched tightly in my hand, my finger hovering over the emergency button, just in case. When the police finally arrived, they combed the area around my house but found nothing. The man had vanished, leaving behind no trace of his presence, as if he had never been there at all. The officers reassured me that they would keep an eye on the neighborhood, but they couldn't do much without more information. I was left standing there, my nerves frayed, feeling helpless. It didn't make sense. Why would he just stand there and take pictures of me? What did he want? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every noise, every creak of the house made me jump. I kept the lights on, my phone by my side, and the curtains drawn tightly. But no matter how much I tried to calm myself down, the unease remained. I couldn't forget the image of the man standing there, his phone raised, as if he was documenting something. I felt exposed, like my privacy had been violated in a way I couldn't understand. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia. I kept expecting to see the man again, but I never did. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, and every time I stepped outside, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. I started locking all the doors and windows before bed, checking them twice, and even setting up a camera at the front door, just in case. Then, one evening, about a week after the incident, I received a text message. It was a photo of me sitting on my couch, the same image I had seen earlier, but this time the photo was taken from a different angle, from outside my window. The text read, "I'm still watching." My blood ran cold as I stared at the message. My first thought was to call the police again, but I was too terrified to move. Who was this person? Why couldn't they just leave me alone? I had no idea how the person had gotten my phone number, but the sense of violation was overwhelming. I felt completely powerless, like I was trapped in my own home, at the mercy of someone who knew more about me than I could ever understand. I kept thinking back to that night, to the way the man had stood there, taking pictures of me as if he were preparing for something worse. The days that followed were filled with a constant sense of dread. I couldn't relax, couldn't sleep. The thought that someone was still watching me, still tracking my every move, gnawed at my mind. I tried to find comfort in the fact that the police were aware of the situation, but even their presence didn't ease the paranoia that had taken hold of me. No matter how much I tried to move on with my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting for the next time he would show up at my window. I was no longer alone in my own home. And the worst part, I couldn't tell if he was still watching me now, or if he would ever stop. Story 30. At first, it seemed like nothing more than friendly office banter. A co-worker, someone I barely knew, would stop by my desk every day around the same time. He'd ask how I was doing, if I had any fun plans for the weekend, or whether I liked the coffee from the break room. It felt harmless at first, but there was something unsettling about his persistence. He'd linger for longer than necessary, his questions veering into more personal territory than I was comfortable with. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just one of those overly friendly types. But as the days went by, his questions began to feel invasive. He'd ask about my family, what I did in my free time, even about past relationships. I didn't mind casual conversation, but this felt different. He seemed overly eager to know details I hadn't shared with anyone at work. And each time I tried to politely excuse myself, he'd find a reason to stay just a little longer. It wasn't until one afternoon that things took a turn. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on an important report, when I noticed him again. He stood nearby, watching me in a way that felt off. I felt his gaze on me long before I turned to look, and when I did, he quickly averted his eyes, as if trying to appear casual. His smile seemed forced, as if it didn't quite reach his eyes. He asked me the usual question, something about my weekend plans, but this time I noticed something in his hand, his phone. I didn't think much of it until he quickly turned it away, almost protectively, as if hiding something. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about that phone, about the way he had acted when I caught a glimpse of it. The next day, as I walked past his desk, I couldn't resist glancing down at his screen, just for a second. To my horror, I saw a photo of myself on his phone. It was taken from across the room, the camera angled just enough to capture me sitting at my desk. The image wasn't blurry, nor was it accidental, it was clear, deliberate. My stomach twisted in knots. I didn't know what to do. The first thing that came to mind was to confront him, but I wasn't sure how to handle the situation. Was this just a weird coincidence? Was he just being overly friendly, or was there something more sinister at play? I decided I couldn't let it slide. The next time I saw him at my desk, I decided to take action. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease creeping through me. He smiled that same unnerving smile and followed me to a quiet corner of the office. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to steady my nerves. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I pushed through. "I saw a photo of me on your phone. You took it from across the room." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened slightly. There was a moment of silence, a beat where I almost thought he might deny it, make an excuse. But then he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I like to watch," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no trace of guilt, no apology, just a matter-of-fact statement that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, not knowing how to respond. My mind raced, but no words came. I wasn't sure whether to laugh it off, to run, or to scream. His eyes never left mine, the weight of his words sinking in. I tried to back away, but something held me there. I could feel the unease growing, a sense of danger that I couldn't shake. "What do you mean by that?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. He tilted his head, as if contemplating my question. "I mean, I like to observe people. It's fascinating, really," he replied, his tone still eerily calm. "You never know what people are really like, but I'm patient. I like to watch before I get to know them. It's the best way to understand someone." I took a step back, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. Was this just some twisted game to him? Or was he seriously implying something darker, something more dangerous? I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just talking about observing me at work. There was something deeper, something far more unsettling in his words. "I'm going to report this," I said, more to myself than to him, though my voice had gained some strength. His smile widened, but it wasn't reassuring. It was the smile of someone who knew something I didn't. A smile that made my skin crawl. "Go ahead," he said softly, as if daring me. "You won't get far." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned quickly and walked back to my desk, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. My thoughts were a whirlwind. What should I do? Who could I tell? I was sure my coworker hadn't been watching me just at the office. The thought that he might be following me, stalking me, lingered in the back of my mind. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. Was I being watched right now? Was he somewhere nearby, observing me again? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on work. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking nearby, his eyes on me. When I left the office that evening, I found myself looking over my shoulder every few steps, scanning the parking lot for any sign of him. I felt trapped, like there was no escape from his presence, no way to avoid the dark shadow that seemed to loom over me. I reported him to HR the next morning, but the response was anything but reassuring. They seemed to take the matter seriously, but they also brushed it off as an isolated incident, something that could be dealt with privately. I knew deep down that the situation wasn't over. He was still out there, still watching. And now, I was left wondering how far he was willing to go. How far would I let him go?